Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Bedtime. I know many of you tune in to these stories to help you drift off to sleep. So before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I just got back from a trip to Nashville, Arkansas, a small town where I spent the holiday weekend visiting my dad and meeting my stepmom, Elaine, for the first time. They'd gotten married quickly, and I wasn't there, but I had granted them that wish. The visit was nice, and I enjoyed getting to know her. But something strange happened during the trip. Actually, it happened early this morning. It was around 3 a.m. on Tuesday, the 29th. I had to wake up that early to catch my plane out of Texarkana, which was about an hour's drive away. The event could possibly be explained, but it left me puzzled, and I can't quite shake the feeling. I had brought my iBook computer along for the trip. On Monday, the three of us went out to the backyard to take some photos together. One picture turned out great, with all of us smiling. I downloaded it quickly and kept it up on my computer screen for the rest of the day. Now, my computer has this timed fade-out feature, where if the screen isn't touched for a while, it blacks out. The only way to turn the screen back on is if you touch the finger pad, the small square you use to move the cursor. So, right before bed at around 10 p.m. on Monday, I walked over to the computer and brushed my finger over the pad. The screen lit up, displaying the photo again. I glanced at it as I went to bed and settled under the covers. As usual, the screen blacked out after a few minutes and the room was plunged into darkness. Fast forward to around 3 a.m. I woke up on my own just before my alarm went off. I noticed something odd right away. The computer screen was on, illuminating the room with that same photo of the three of us. Instantly, a chill ran down my spine. The screen shouldn't have been on. It had been off for hours. I got up quickly to check if something, maybe an insect, had crawled across the pad and turned it on. But there was nothing there. As I stood by the computer, the screen went black again. I returned to bed, trying to shake the unease, when my alarm suddenly went off, startling me. As I reached to turn it off, I glanced at a figurine on the nightstand beside me, one that had been there the entire visit, but I hadn't really paid attention to until that moment. It was a small figure of a girl, kneeling with angel wings, her hands clasped in prayer. It gave me an odd feeling, because it reminded me of a vision I had once, of a girl with angel wings, just before leaving somewhere. It could just be a coincidence, but between the computer being on and the figurine, I couldn't help but feel a little unsettled. Another thing I learned on this trip was that Elaine had a daughter who was born the same year as I was. Tragically, she died in a car accident around prom or homecoming about 10 years ago. With me leaving so early this morning, I didn't get a chance to ask Elaine where that angel figurine came from. I wanted to, but I didn't want to bring it up without a good reason, especially since we were just getting to know each other. I also didn't feel comfortable asking her about her daughter's death or whether she's experienced anything strange since then. I didn't want to upset her or make her think I was crazy. But as I left early this morning, I had so many questions running through my mind. Since May 22nd, I've been feeling like something is just a little off. I don't want to exaggerate or make things up in my head, but things have felt different, like my life is slightly off balance. These new developments might mean nothing at all, but I can't help but notice them. I'm paying attention to the details, just in case something unusual really is happening around me. It's hard to pick just one story to share. There have been so many moments in my life that have left me terrified. But after some thought and advice from my adoptive mother, I decided to share one of my earliest experiences. This happened when I was 10 years old, living in my parents' house in Kansas City, Missouri. I was getting ready for bed one night when I started to feel like someone was watching me. It wasn't an entirely new feeling. I'd felt it before, but it scared me nonetheless. Despite my fear, I went about my routine, brushing my teeth, combing my hair, and grabbing a book to read while falling asleep. But the feeling that someone was watching me, or worse, wanting to hurt me, wouldn't go away. After a few minutes of searching around my room and freaking out, I decided to turn all my dolls and stuffed animals around. I didn't want them looking at me. Then I turned off the main light, but kept the desk lamp on, hoping it would offer some comfort. As I lay there, I tried convincing myself it was just my younger brother playing a prank. But just as I was ready to close my eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The closet door slowly creaked open. Even now, I still have a fear of open closets in dark or dimly lit rooms. Out of the closet, a figure emerged. It was dark and shadowy, and I got the strong sense that it was a he, mean, cruel, and full of malice. I watched in frozen terror as he came closer, eventually sitting down on my bed. I could feel the weight of his presence, and when he sat on my feet, it felt as if an entire body was pressing down on me. For what felt like minutes, he just sat there, turning his head as if he was looking around the room before finally focusing on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't move. It was as if my body had completely betrayed me, leaving me helpless. He reached out slowly, his hand coming towards my face. I felt a cold touch on my chin, then my neck, and then nothing. Just as quickly and quietly as he had appeared, he vanished. I sat there for a moment, tears streaming down my face, before I finally found the strength to move. I bolted to my parents' room, shaking and sobbing as I told them what had happened. My mother just looked at me and told me not to say anything to anyone. This is just one of the many experiences I've had. Over time, I've tried to learn how to live with what I see, hear, and feel, but it's hard. It's difficult to ignore these things, yet I can't dedicate my life to them either. I'm still trying to figure out how to balance it all. This is one of those stories that has been passed down through the family, and it was my father who told it to me. Since he passed away, I can't ask him to clarify any details, but I'll share it as best as I can remember. The story happened to my great-grandparents a couple of generations back when they lived in Arkansas. They were very poor, what you might call true hillbillies. They lived in a small house, surrounded by fields far out in the country. They were just starting their life together, completely self-sufficient and isolated. My dad's mother wasn't even born yet at the time. One night, after my great-grandparents had just climbed into bed, there was a sudden pounding at their front door. In those days, around the 1890s, someone knocking at such a late hour usually meant trouble. There were no close neighbors, no phones, and people lived by the rule of early to bed, early to rise. Great-grandpa called out, asking who it was, but there was no response. After asking a few more times and hearing nothing, they decided to wait and see what would happen. When some time passed without any more noise, they went back to bed. But they couldn't shake the unease. They were isolated, so opening the door to a stranger, especially at night, could be dangerous. They were cautious and frustrated, unsure of what was going on. The knocking happened again over the next few nights. It might have been consecutive nights, or just sporadic, I'm not sure. Each time, Great-Grandpa would ask who was there, but nobody ever answered. He started getting worried, so he kept his hunting gun near the door, just in case. That was the home security system back then, though he hoped he wouldn't have to use it. After several nights of this strange knocking, they began to consider the possibility of something unseen, something beyond explanation. Back then, hillbilly superstitions were common, and my great-grandparents weren't closed-minded to such things. So they decided to sprinkle flour on the front steps, hoping it might reveal something if the knocking happened again. Before long, just as they suspected, the knocking resumed one evening after they had gotten ready for bed. Great-grandpa grabbed his gun, cautiously prepared for whatever might happen, and called out again, asking who was there. When there was no answer, he positioned himself at the door with his gun, ready if necessary. Great-grandma, on his signal, flung the door wide open, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and nobody was in sight. When they looked down, they saw footprints in the flour, leading up to the door. But what was even more unsettling was that the footprints just stopped, right at the door. There were no prints leading away. Great-grandma said a quick prayer, and the two of them stood there, terrified and shaken. As far as I know, that was the last time the knocking occurred. My dad was an amazing storyteller, and he told this story many times over the years. always with the same details. He swore it was true, and I believe him. He was my dad, after all. I don't think he embellished the story too much, if at all. My aunt, his sister, also backs up the story as true. When I was in junior high, my dad's company kept him away from home 3 weeks out of the month. As a teenager, I didn't mind. It gave me more freedom. But for him, it was exhausting. His company, based in Nebraska, also had a location in a small town called Marianna, Arkansas, about 45 minutes from West Memphis. Since my dad and 2 other engineers spent most of their time there, the company decided to stop spending money on hotel stays and bought an old house for the guys to stay in. My dad was there most of the time, and sometimes up to 4 men stayed in the house. He helped find a huge manor-style house on one of the main streets in town, built in the late 1800s. The house had belonged to a woman who passed away with no surviving relatives, and her furniture remained in the house. They were thrilled to get a 5-bedroom mansion, fully furnished, for a great price. The house even had an old elevator, installed for the previous owner's daughter who had polio. Rather than carrying her up and down 3 flights of stairs, they added the elevator. At first, we all thought it was pretty cool. For the first couple of months, everything went smoothly. The guys were close to work, and the house became a second home for them. But after about 2 months, strange things started happening. They would be woken up at night by the sound of the elevator moving up and down. My dad would get up to check it, but everything always seemed fine. He figured it was just old wiring and tried not to think much of it, even though it happened 2 or 3 times a night. The house also had a caretaker who came in a few times a week to clean and keep an eye on the place when no one was staying there. She started complaining that her cleaning supplies would go missing, and sometimes she felt like someone was there with her. Once, she lost her gardening gloves and bought new ones, only to find the old ones sitting on the kitchen table when she returned. One night, I remember my dad calling my mom in a panic. He and a couple of the other guys had gone to Memphis for dinner on Beale Street. They'd had a few beers and some ribs, then came back to the house. Around 2 a.m., my dad and Larry, whose room was next to my dad's, were both woken by the sound of someone running up and down the hall, as if they were heading to the bathroom. They both thought there was an intruder in the house. My dad kept a handgun in his nightstand, so he grabbed it, and he and Larry went to check. They were sure they'd find someone in the bathroom. But when they opened the door, they only found muddy footprints leading into the bathtub, then nothing. The footprints just stopped. They checked the windows and doors, but everything was locked and secure. After that night, they started joking about the old ghosts of the house, but no one ever felt fully comfortable staying there alone. That August, the company decided to fly all the families into Memphis for a company picnic. We stayed in Forest City, about halfway between Marianna and Memphis, and spent one afternoon at the house. All of the men had teenage daughters, and I guess they thought we wouldn't be too comfortable staying overnight in that place. As teenage girls tend to do, we decided to snoop around. When you went up the first set of stairs, there was a large portrait of the original owner hanging at the landing on the second floor. It wasn't that old, probably from the 60s or 70s, but the way the woman in the painting was looking straight ahead made it feel like she was watching you, no matter where you moved. It creeped us out. My friend and I got curious and decided to check out the attic. As we opened the door leading to the attic stairs, a basket of fake flowers suddenly flew down the stairs at us. It was like someone had thrown it from the top of the stairs. It scared the life out of us, and we bolted downstairs as fast as we could. There was no way we were going to try using the elevator after that. Our dads just chuckled and said the basket must have fallen off something in the attic. Sure, it just happened to fall right at us. We were convinced the old lady didn't want us snooping around her house. The company kept the house for about another 6 months before they finally sold it. My dad and I still talk about driving by the house if we're ever in the area again. Maybe even asking the new owners if they still have wiring problems with the elevator. I was about 9 years old at the time, and my best friend Celia had just celebrated her birthday the day before. She had turned 9 as well. That night, I stayed over at her house along with our other friend Greta. We had a typical fun night like any kids having a sleepover, staying up late and playing games. The next morning, we decided to play our favorite game, hide and seek, but we mixed it up a little. This time, Celia would hide, and Greta and I would both be the seekers. Celia was a really good hider, so we thought teaming up would give us a better chance to find her. Greta and I started counting in Celia's mom's bedroom, and we could hear Celia's footsteps rushing around the house, trying to find a good hiding spot. Finally, we finished counting and yelled, "Celia, you better find a place fast. We're coming." We stepped out of the room, and that's when things got strange. As we looked across the hallway, we saw Celia running into her bedroom. Or at least, that's what we thought. The figure looked just like her, but something was off. She looked kind of foggy, almost like she was glowing. And there was nothing from the hips down. She just floated through the door. For some reason, Greta and I didn't really register how strange this was in the moment. We thought, we've got her now, and barged into her bedroom, confident that we'd caught her. But when we got inside, Celia was nowhere to be found. We searched all over the room, but there was no way she could have slipped out without us seeing. The room wasn't big enough for her to hide without being noticed. Still confused, Greta and I yelled, "Celia, just come out, we can't find you." Moments later, Celia came strolling in from the living room. Greta and I exchanged glances, both of us thinking, "Wait, didn't we just see her go into this room?" I turned to Greta and said, "Didn't we see her go into her room?" Greta nodded, equally puzzled. "Yeah, I saw it too." Celia stood there, confused, wondering what we were talking about. I asked her how she had managed to slip out of her room without us noticing, and she replied, "I was never in my room. I've been hiding behind the couch the whole time." That's when Greta and I started piecing it together. What we had seen wasn't exactly Celia. The figure had been transparent, glowing, and kind of foggy. It didn't have any legs and had walked or floated through the door, but it had looked exactly like her. We quickly told Celia what we had seen, and the three of us spent the rest of the morning trying to figure it out. Our first thought was ghost, and like any smart kids, we ran to tell her mom what had happened. Her mom, of course, brushed it off, telling us we were just imagining things. But I know we weren't. Greta and I saw the same thing, and it still puzzles me to this day. We thought maybe it was some kind of out-of-body experience, like Celia's spirit had left her body for a moment, but she said she felt perfectly fine, and didn't feel like her life had slipped away or anything. I'm 13 now, and the three of us still haven't figured out what we saw that day. It's a mystery that stayed with us all these years. My boyfriend and I moved into our duplex apartment in East Camden, Arkansas, around February 2007, just 2 months before I gave birth to our son, Micah. At first, everything was normal, but about 2 weeks after we moved in, something strange happened. One morning, while my boyfriend was at work, I woke up around 8 a.m. and was watching TV in bed when I heard a loud knock on the front door. I'm not the type to open the door for strangers, so I got up to check. I peeked out the window, but there was nobody there. I looked up and down the street. No one walking, no car driving off. It didn't make sense that someone could have knocked and disappeared that quickly. I checked every window, but saw nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably my imagination. A month after Micah was born, the same thing happened again around the same time in the morning. I had to quickly grab some shorts because I was still in my nightgown. As I was dressing, I heard another knock, this time impatient, as if someone was rushing me. Irritated, I yelled, "Just a minute," and hurried across the living room. It didn't even take me 5 seconds to reach the window, but when I looked out, there was nobody there. This time, I knew for sure something was off. There was no way anyone could have knocked and vanished that quickly without me seeing them. That's when I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Months passed, and by then, my dog had puppies. We had put her in the spare bedroom, and one day, while I was home alone with the baby, I heard loud knocking coming from that room. At first, I thought the dog was bumping around, so I went to check on her. She was lying down, nursing her puppies, her ears perked up, staring at the wall. Then, I heard it again, the loud knocking. But this time, it was coming from the other side of the wall, the other half of the duplex. The problem? Nobody was living there. It had been locked up for months. The knocking stopped, then started again a minute later. I wasn't exactly scared at that point, more curious than anything. I walked up to the wall where the sound was coming from. It was at chest height, clearly not coming from my dog. On a whim, I knocked back. The knocking stopped. Then, after a moment, it knocked back at me. That's when I felt the chill. I didn't know what to do, so I simply walked out of the room and shut the door behind me. As soon as Micah woke up, I got him dressed and decided to spend the day at my grandparents' house. I didn't want to stay in the apartment any longer that day. After the strange knocking incidents, more unsettling things started happening around the apartment. We had been having trouble getting Micah to sleep through the night, so my boyfriend started sleeping on the couch. Not to get away from us, but just to get some decent sleep, since Micah loved staying up late and would keep him awake. My boyfriend had to wake up at 5:30 a.m. for work, and it was starting to wear him down. One evening, after he came home from work, he asked me if I had gotten up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or anything around 2 a.m. I told him no. I had slept through the night without waking up. He frowned and said it was strange because he had woken up multiple times and heard footsteps coming from our bedroom, moving through the living room, and into the kitchen. He assumed it was me and said that he even saw me walk past the couch, near where his head was, and head into the kitchen. He figured I was getting some water, so he waited to hear the sound of the fridge opening or the light turning on, but nothing happened. After calling out to me several times and getting no response, he got up to check. The kitchen was empty. He came into the bedroom, only to find Micah and me sound asleep. Worried that someone might have broken in, he searched the entire apartment, but found nothing. All the doors and windows were still locked. A few days later, I was home with Micah while my boyfriend was at work. Micah was playing quietly on the living room floor, and I was at the computer. I get nervous when he gets too quiet, so I turned around to check on him. He was calmly playing with his toys, so I turned back to the computer. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked toward the kitchen and saw a small piece of Micah's broken recorder, one of those little musical instruments kids blow into. The end piece, which was shaped like a spool of thread but thinner in the middle, was lying on the floor. It had been rolling back and forth across the kitchen floor, as if someone had pushed it. I froze, watching it as it finally came to a stop. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Confused and unnerved, I went into the kitchen to see if there was any explanation. I tried pushing the piece to see if it would roll the same way again, but it only rolled in circles, nothing like the smooth back and forth motion I had just seen. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right, so I called my sister and had her come over. I needed the company and a distraction from whatever was going on in that apartment. After the knocking and the other strange incidents in the apartment, I stopped being afraid of whatever or whoever was there. It's not that the occurrences stopped, but over time I got used to them. Since we moved in, I've often felt presences enter the room, like waves of energy washing over my body. It usually happens when I'm alone, either watching TV or reading. I'll be lying in bed or on the couch, and suddenly I can feel something enter the room with me. It's not always intense, but on 2 separate occasions, the energy felt overwhelmingly strong, as if someone or something was standing right behind me. The last time it happened, I felt a massive wave of energy hovering about a foot behind me. It was so powerful that I kept turning to look, but of course, there was nothing there. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could feel it looming over me, just a little too close for comfort. I didn't feel threatened, but it was unsettling. Still, I wasn't about to let it know I was scared, so I just kept doing what I was doing and waited for it to pass. Recently, a friend and her mom moved in with us because we were all in need of some help. Money was tight, and they needed a place to stay. One night, my friend had her own eerie encounter. She was in her room when she felt something icy cold rush past her. There were no fans or open windows to explain the draft. Then, she felt something touch her hair, and her dog began growling at something, as if there was someone standing behind her. It terrified her, and she ended up hiding under her covers until she fell asleep. Despite all of this, I don't think whatever is here wants to harm anyone. I've never felt a true sense of danger from it. I don't know the history of this apartment, but strange things have happened to me throughout my life. I can't help but wonder if I'm the one who's haunted, or if I've just been lucky enough to live in 4 haunted houses. About 11 years ago, my mom and stepdad moved into a house in a small town just outside of Camden, Arkansas. The house was a deep gray color, tall, and surrounded by trees, so the yard stayed mostly shaded with hardly any grass. Inside, the house had a huge living room that led straight into the kitchen. To the right was a small hallway with bedrooms at each end and a bathroom in the middle. On the other side of the living room was a door with a vent. Behind that door was a narrow, dark staircase that led to a huge room upstairs. The upstairs room had a walled-off corner with a toilet and bathtub, with the sink just outside that area. At the bottom of the staircase was a landing with 3 small steps that led to the laundry storage room and a sliding door that opened to the backyard. Hopefully, that gives you a sense of the layout. My mom worked as a bartender at a local club, and my stepdad worked security, mainly so he could be there to pick my mom up each night without driving too far. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine, but strange things started happening when they returned home from work. They'd find the lights on in the upstairs room, and sometimes the water would be running. At first, they thought someone was breaking in to mess with them. So one night, they put flour by the doorways and taped all the windows shut. But when they got home, sure enough, the lights and water were on again upstairs, even though nothing else had been disturbed. My mom went upstairs to turn everything off and said aloud, "Whoever you are, if you're good, you can stay. But if you're not, you need to leave, and stop turning on the lights and water. We can't afford the bills." After that, the lights and water stayed off. They had a huge German shepherd named Nick, and he was terrified of the upstairs room. He would stand at the bottom of the stairs and whine, refusing to go up. The one time they did manage to get him upstairs, he just sat there shaking and whining, then bolted back downstairs as soon as he could. My stepsister Lisa was around 3 years old at the time, and she had her own room downstairs. She used to spend hours playing there, talking and laughing as if someone was with her. When my mom asked who she was talking to, she said it was her friend, though the name sounded odd. Possibly Native American, though none of us could remember it exactly. Lisa described her friend's parents as having long black hair and speaking in a funny way, like Indians, though she had no concept of what Native Americans were at the time. She said that every time my mom came into the room, her friend would disappear, because my mom scared her. My mom assumed it was just an imaginary friend and left it at that. One night, my stepdad's mom was staying over. She was sitting on the couch next to the kitchen and thought she saw my mom's turquoise bathrobe pass by. She called out, asking my mom to make some coffee, but got no response. When she got up to check, the kitchen was completely empty. Another time, my stepdad was home alone, taking a bath with the door open since nobody else was home. When my mom returned from town, she found him sitting outside, visibly shaken. He told her that while he was in the bath, he saw a ball of mist float across the living room and disappear through the vent in the door that led to the upstairs room. It scared him so much that he ran outside in his underwear and got dressed in the car. On another occasion, my mom told me they were having a cookout when they heard strange music coming from the woods behind the house. She said it was the weirdest music she'd ever heard and couldn't even describe it to me. They also saw lights coming from the woods, even though no one lived back there. Just miles of trees. The men grabbed their flashlights and guns to investigate, but they never found the source of the music or the lights. When my sister and I visited on the weekends, we would sometimes play upstairs, but we never stayed for long. After a while, we'd get so scared that we'd have to run back downstairs. My mom always made a pallet in the living room because we were too frightened to sleep upstairs more than once or twice. We always felt like someone was watching us. After they moved out, a lady my mom knew moved into the house. She ran into my mom one day, and asked if anything strange had ever happened there. My mom told her about a few things, and the lady shared that she had seen a ball of mist come from the door with the vent, and halfway across the living room, it turned into the figure of a woman before going out the front door. It was almost the same thing my stepdad had seen. Even now, every time I drive past that house, which isn't often, I feel drawn to it, like something is calling me back. I don't know why, but if I had the money and it was still for sale, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. It might sound strange, but I feel like there's something waiting for me there. This personal account dates back to the late 1970s, when I was about 19 years old. At the time, I had moved into a newer home with 4 other roommates. One of my roommates missed her mother deeply, as she had passed away several years earlier. As for me, I had developed a strong interest in the paranormal and psychic phenomena. I had even honed enough skill to sometimes sense spirits, hear faint voices, and occasionally catch glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye. We also had a friend named Robin, whom we called Bird. She had definite psychic abilities, and her mother was a tarot card reader who followed astral charts and planned her activities around them. Bird didn't live with us, but she was a close friend to all of us. There were a lot of strange, unexplained things that happened in that house. Lights would turn on by themselves, and occasionally the bathroom faucet would turn on full blast for a few seconds before shutting off again. It was all very odd, but things took a more intense turn one night when I was home alone. I was in my room reading when I heard the front door open, followed by one of my roommates shouting in alarm. "What the hell? Oh my God, who did this?" Confused, I opened my bedroom door, and smoke poured into the hallway. Somehow, the coffee pot had been placed on the electric stove burner, which had turned itself to high. The handle had melted, filling the house with smoke. My roommate was convinced I had done it, but I had been in my room the entire time. No one else could have entered the house without me hearing them, and I had no explanation for how it happened. Most of the time, the house felt normal, but other times, there was an undeniable sense of being watched. One of my friends once came by, rang the doorbell, and was overcome with an overwhelming feeling of dread. He was so spooked that he ran back to his car and left without even coming inside. Things escalated when my roommate wanted to communicate with her late mother. Bird agreed to lead a seance, and so it was just me, Bird, and my roommate in the house that night. Bird lit several candles, and we began. I did my best to stay open and offer positive energy to the room. As the seance progressed, we felt we were getting close to making contact. That's when I sensed something dark. A heavy, shadowy presence approached us from the hallway, though it didn't have a clear form. The atmosphere around us darkened, and I could tell Bird sensed it too because she kept glancing at the hallway, just like I was. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang from one of the back rooms, as if someone had slapped a huge wooden board against the wall. At the same moment, all the candles went out, leaving us in complete darkness. We jumped in shock, and the seance came to an abrupt halt. We searched the house, checking every room, every closet, and even outside, but we found nothing that could have caused the sound. Determined, we relit the candles and began again. The seance progressed as it had before, but once again, the dark shadow manifested. And once again, there was a loud bang. At that point, we decided to stop for the night. A few weeks later, we threw a big party, and about 30 people showed up. Among them was my friend who had run from the house in fear before. At some point during the party, he brought a candle into my room and suggested we hold a seance to figure out what was haunting the house. I wasn't keen on the idea, but it seemed harmless enough as a party game, so I went along with it. He began saying things like, "Any spirits in the house, show yourself now." Almost immediately, I felt a terrible, malevolent presence in the top corner of the room. It was feeding off the fear it created in me, growing stronger with each wave. It wasn't just me who felt it. Looking around at the others, I could see the terror hitting them one by one. The energy in the room was suffocating. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I shouted at the presence to leave, my fear turning into anger. After a moment, the feeling lifted and the room returned to normal. Still, I asked my friend to stay in the room with me that night, and thankfully, he did. Other strange things continued to happen in that house. Objects would move on their own, things would break without explanation. We tried to find a logical reason for it all, and the only theory we came up with was the possibility of EMF, electromagnetic fields. The house was located right next to a massive 9-tower AM radio station. You could hear the station through the phone, on the TV, and even on the FM radio band. While it's plausible that EMF could affect thoughts and perceptions, it couldn't explain physical phenomena like coffee pots turning on by themselves, loud bangs, and candles being extinguished simultaneously. This was the 1970s. None of our appliances had remote controls. Those few years in that house marked the beginning of my most significant paranormal experiences, some of which have stayed with me even to this day. Throughout my life, I've had my fair share of odd experiences, though maybe not as many as some other members of my family. We've never doubted the existence of ghosts, but my mother always discouraged us from dwelling on it too much. She believed that thinking about it could make things worse. I tend to agree, but that never stopped my sister and me from discussing it, even to this day. When I was 12, we moved into a new house out in the woods. It was a double-wide trailer, but not a bad one. We knew that spirits could be tied to objects or houses, but we had no idea that they could be attached to the land itself. Not long after we moved in, my brother began complaining that his bedroom door would open and close by itself during the night. He didn't seem too bothered by it, and the rest of the family didn't think much of it either. So we all soon forgot about it. It was the middle of the summer of 1994 when something strange first happened to my sister and me. We loved playing with our toy ponies, and that day, her friend Darlana had come over. We spent hours coming up with new plots for our ponies, crafting elaborate stories as we played. By the end of the day, we left our ponies on the coffee table, arranged to reflect their various storylines. Some ponies were in a kissing pose, others were turned away because they didn't like each other. We left them like that and went to bed. The next morning, when we sat down to start playing again, we noticed something odd. All the ponies had been moved. Ponies that were supposed to hate each other were now facing each other, as if they were kissing. I don't remember every detail, but the whole setup had a funny, almost mischievous quality to it. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had moved them had been paying close attention to our stories and knew exactly which pony was which. Naturally, we assumed it was our older brother. He hated our ponies and always made fun of us for playing with them, so it made sense that he'd mess with them. We immediately confronted him with accusations, but he denied it, swearing he would never touch them. To be honest, it did seem unlikely. He didn't even know the characters in our pony world, and the one time he had touched one, it was to try to wrench its head off. Our mom was also not a likely suspect. She barely paid attention to our pony stories and was the last person who'd pull a prank like that. So, after some time discussing it, my sister and her friend finally agreed with me that it had to be something else, something we couldn't explain. That's when the idea hit us. It must have been a ghost. Excited by the thought, we decided to leave the ponies out again the following night to see if anything would happen. The next morning, a couple of ponies had been moved, but nothing major. It didn't really happen again after that, but the memory of that first morning stayed with me. Over the years, many strange things happened in that house, but that playful pony prank remains my favorite. It felt like we had an audience to our stories, someone, or something, with a sense of humor. I never felt anything truly malevolent in that house. Sure, there were moments when I was scared out of my wits, but looking back, it was always more funny than frightening. To this day, I'm still convinced that whatever spirit was in that house had a good sense of humor. When I was 12 years old, I had an experience that still confuses me to this day. I was staying with my grandmother, who was going through a tough divorce at the time. That night, she cooked a great dinner, and after, I went to bed and slept like a rock until dawn. I woke up as the first light of the sun began to rise, wide awake. My eyes were immediately drawn to the upper corner of my bedroom, and that's when I saw them. Several small apparitions. I believe they were angels. They were absolutely beautiful, each about 2 feet tall, fluffy, and transparent. I closed my eyes, opened them again, and they were still there. I did this a few times, thinking I might be imagining it, but they remained. Eventually, I sat up in bed, and it was as if I startled them. They faded away almost instantly. Confused but curious, I decided to go to my grandmother's room. As I turned, I saw something that left me in shock. Standing beside my bed, only 2 feet away from me, was a small dark figure about 3 feet tall. It wore a black cloak with a hood, but there was no face, almost like a miniature Grim Reaper without a scythe. Surprisingly, I wasn't scared, just frozen. I stared at it for what felt like a full minute before it turned and glided silently out of my room. I followed it down the hallway to my grandmother's room, where it disappeared. I'll never forget how cold the floor felt under my bare feet as I walked. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen for nearly a year. I was afraid people would think I was dreaming, crazy, or lying. I was only 12, after all. But every time I saw Halloween decorations of the Grim Reaper or my friends dressed up as one, I would feel a jolt of fear. Still, I kept it to myself. About a year later, my mom, grandmother, and I were driving to Memphis for a day of shopping. Out of nowhere, my grandmother said, "I have to tell y'all something. I can't keep it to myself anymore. I've been seeing things. Angels." I sat up anxiously in the back seat and blurted out, "I saw them too." I had never been so relieved to hear that I wasn't alone. My grandmother went on to tell us about her first experience. She said she woke up in the middle of the night to find her room glowing. Above her bed, she saw a beautiful angel with wings, accompanied by 2 small childlike angels. After they disappeared, she got up, had a Coke, and watched TV, laughing to herself, thinking, "I guess I'm not ready to die just yet." That's when I told her my story, including the part about the dark, hooded figure by my bed. She chuckled and said, "Maybe he was looking for Larry," referring to my grandfather, who had left her for a 23-year-old after 40 years of marriage. My grandmother shared more stories about seeing angels, though she asked us not to tell anyone. She only experienced beautiful, comforting sightings, never anything frightening. But one day I asked her if she'd seen any angels recently, and her answer chilled me. "Yes, I saw one last week. But this one was different," she said. When I asked her what she meant, she replied, "It was ugly. It had a big head. I said a prayer and told it, 'You can't hurt me. God won't let you hurt me.' It just smiled at me and disappeared." That comment stuck with me, and it worried me. A month later, my grandmother developed pneumonia and was admitted to the hospital. The fluid in her lungs began to crystallize and harden, a condition known as ARDS, Adult Respiratory Distress Syndrome. She spent 28 days in the ICU on a ventilator, suffered a stroke, and on May 1st, 1999, my family made the decision to take her off life support. Since her death, I haven't seen any angels or demons, but I try not to talk about it too much. The last time my mom and I discussed the events, a bright light appeared in the room, and we both screamed. I was 20 at the time, but I ended up sleeping in my mom's room that night. I believe the angels were there for protection, and that the dark figure was a sign of death. I often think about how, when I sat up that morning, I scared the angels away, but not the dark figure. Instead, I followed it. It's one of those experiences that you can't quite explain, no matter how much you try. I've talked to several pastors about it, but none of them had much to say. I think I might have freaked them out. Let me start by saying that I'm not entirely sure what kind of spirit I'm dealing with, and I certainly didn't summon it on my own. I'm a practicing solitary. I don't claim any specific religion as my own. I believe there's some truth in everything. It all began around my birthday, October 20th. I had moved into a new house in early September, and everything had been normal up until that point. It started with voices. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I began hearing a male voice. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I was fully awake when I sat up. The voice didn't stop. I got up, woke my roommate, and while he didn't hear the voice, we both heard loud thuds in the hallway. After a while, the noises stopped, and we went back to bed. But it didn't end there. The noises became worse, starting with a steady pounding sound that echoed through the house, mostly at night. We couldn't locate the source. It didn't get louder or quieter, no matter where we were. I continued hearing the male voice, sometimes just as I was about to sleep. other times even after waking up. By then, the voice had become almost constant whenever I entered the bedroom. A low, moaning sound, like something straight out of a bad horror movie. Soon, the pounding was joined by scratching, loud bangs, and more. My roommate started hearing the same things, including the voice. 5 days into this, I'd had enough. It had been getting progressively worse, and one night, I finally decided to speak to it. I told the entity it was fine if it stayed, but the noises had to stop because it was scaring us. Surprisingly, after that, the loud noises ceased, but only when it didn't want attention. I later realized the noises had been a way to get my attention all along. However, speaking to it must have done something, because soon after, it began to manifest in other ways. I started feeling light footsteps and hearing loud breathing or wind around me. It rarely spoke, but its presence was undeniable. I tried to cleanse the space with the LBRP, Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, several times, but its visitations became even more intense. That's when it latched onto me. The sensations were very real. I could feel it touch the top of my head, like something lightly stroking my hair. Most of the time, the touch was gentle, slightly cold, and gave me goosebumps. Other times, it felt like cool water running over me, or a soft blanket wrapping around me. On rare occasions, it felt prickly, like something from nature brushing against me. When it came very close, the air would grow unbearably hot, making me sweat. It also seemed to be able to hear my thoughts. If I asked it, even in my mind, to stop, it would. I would often become paralyzed when it was near, but I was always wide awake, fully aware of its presence. Its touch was usually pleasant, and it always stopped when I wanted it to, though sometimes it felt like pressure on my throat or chest, which could be briefly painful. The first time I saw the entity, I was in a semi-lucid state, just on the edge of sleep. I found myself walking around my bathroom and picked up a piece of paper that had something about grounding and a scarab on it. Suddenly I was back in bed, and I was lifted about 6 inches off of it. The entity surrounded me. It was warm, soft, and solid. I could feel it kiss my belly, and then it felt like it was inside my body, under my clothes. I got scared, and it pulled away. It was transparent, human-shaped, and I could see its face, male, with distinct but water-like features. I could touch it, and it felt solid. But when I opened my eyes, it was gone, though I could still feel it wrapped around me like a blanket slowly being drawn away. After that, it began visiting me regularly, when I woke up before I went to sleep, and even when I was just sitting around. One night, it kept me up all night, gently touching me. I would fall asleep, only to wake up to the feeling of fingers pressing against my collarbone. These sensations would continue even after I opened my eyes. At one point, my roommate saw something unsettling. He told me he saw me in the bedroom while I was actually sitting on the couch. It shook him, but there was nothing in the bedroom when we checked. Over time, I felt an increasing connection to this entity. Sometimes I feel strong emotions that aren't mine, or see flashes of strange images. My awareness of the world around me has heightened. I can hear things in music I never noticed before, feel vibrations and sense energy within objects. However, I've also experienced strange physical sensations, like a heaviness in my chest or a racing heartbeat. Then there was yesterday. I had been feeling sick, and I told the entity. Shortly after, the pain eased. As I lay in bed, I felt like I was falling, and suddenly I was walking around my house. I knew I was having an out-of-body experience. I returned to my room, feeling waves of warmth wash over me, and I knew I was back in my body, fully awake. The entity was with me again, and I felt its presence strongly, as if it was wrapped around me. It sought intercourse, and my body felt like it was on fire, pure bliss for about an hour. When my roommate came home, the entity grew angry and the noises in the hallway intensified. Eventually, I asked it to leave, and it reluctantly did. I've tried to communicate with it using a Ouija board and automatic writing, but it doesn't respond. I've also tried holy water, salt, and cleansing rituals, but nothing seems to banish it. I don't feel afraid of it anymore, only love and softness from it. My only concern is that if this entity noticed me without any provocation, how long before something darker, something negative, takes notice? As a child, I never had any paranormal experiences until I turned 12. What happened after that was entirely my own doing, and I've been living with the consequences ever since. I grew up in a devout Catholic family and always believed in God. I had never dabbled in anything occult-related before. In fact, I knew better than to mess with those things. But for some reason, one morning, I had a momentary lapse in judgment, a decision I still don't fully understand. It happened while I was staying with my grandfather for a week on his 1,500-acre farm. My parents were away on a trip to Spain, and I was left to stay with him in his old, somewhat creepy house deep in the countryside. One morning, before the sun had come up, I woke up early and found myself thinking about an episode of The Twilight Zone that I'd seen. In it, a terminally ill man makes a deal with the devil, trading his soul for 1,000 years of life, during which he couldn't die. My 12-year-old mind began to wonder, what if I could make a deal for the things I wanted? Without thinking it through, I sat up in bed and started speaking aloud. I will trade you this and that, I said, listing off the things I wanted at the time in exchange for my soul. I waited. Nothing happened. Feeling a bit foolish, I lay back down and tried to fall asleep. But just as I was on the verge of sleep, ironically, in the state they call the Twilight Zone, I felt something grab the back of my neck, hard. I bolted upright, startled, but when I looked around, the room was empty. I tried to brush it off as a dream and lay back down, falling asleep not long after. I don't know how long I slept, but suddenly I was wide awake again. That's when I saw it, a massive shadowy figure standing over me. The room was pitch black, but the presence was unmistakable. I was pinned to the bed, unable to move or scream. The whole experience lasted about 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Terrified, I closed my eyes, and that's when I heard it. A moan, not with my ears but inside my head. It started low, then grew into a blood-curdling scream. Words can't capture how inhuman the sound was. It was like something straight from hell. My heart pounded so hard that I'm convinced the only reason I didn't die from fright was my young, healthy body. Finally, with all my strength, I managed to mouth the word stop, and instantly, everything ceased. I was trembling so hard that for a moment I thought the bed itself was shaking. I've never prayed so hard in my life as I did then, lying frozen in fear. After what felt like hours, I summoned the courage to move and practically burst through the bedroom door. That night was the worst of my experiences, but it wasn't the last. For years after, I continued to be visited by this force. I would be held to my bed, unable to move or speak, but I would feel its presence, always waiting in the darkness. Strangely enough, it didn't always happen while I was asleep. On certain nights, I could sense it before it came. I'd feel a tingle at the base of my spine that would creep up toward my head. When it reached my neck, I would be completely paralyzed. I learned to brace myself when I felt it coming, tensing up to hold the sensation at the base of my spine, but it never lasted. Eventually, out of exhaustion, I would give in and the force would take hold. Although I never saw the shadow figure again, the experiences didn't stop. I would hear loud buzzing noises or feel sudden waves of panic that hit me like a punch to the gut. Sometimes I had nightmares, vivid, evil dreams unlike any I'd had before. I'm convinced they were connected to what I had brought upon myself. The fear from these experiences haunted me throughout my teenage years. What has always puzzled me, though, is why God didn't protect me from these repeated attacks. After all, my faith in Him only grew stronger. I prayed constantly for protection, especially at night, but it never seemed to help. I would call out in the darkness, rebuking the entity in the name of Jesus, but nothing changed. Some people might say I'm damned for what I did, that by offering my soul, I placed myself entirely in Satan's power. But I don't believe that. I don't think I'm forever condemned for a mistake I made as a child. God's power and forgiveness can save anyone, and I've made my peace with what I did. Over the years, the experiences have become less frequent, and now they rarely happen. But I still wonder why I had to go through it all. Maybe my torment was my penance, and I've finally paid the price for my childhood mistake. Whatever the reason, I know one thing for sure. I've learned my lesson, and I'll never make that kind of mistake again. All my life, wherever I went, it seemed like I was followed by both divine and evil forces. It didn't matter where I lived. I always ended up in a haunted house. Eventually, I started to wonder if it was me that was haunted, rather than the places I lived. Sometimes I think back on all the strange things that have happened to me and question whether I'm just crazy. But deep down, I know I'm not. I once confided the story to my best friend, and he revealed that something similar had happened to him when he was about 16. I'm sharing this for anyone else who might have gone through something similar, but feels too afraid or embarrassed to talk about it. I'm still not entirely sure what happened to me that night, but it's haunted me ever since. A shaman friend once suggested it could have been an incubus, but I don't know for sure. I was 23 when it happened, just after I had moved to the city on my own. I'd rented an apartment in an older part of town. It was my 5th apartment, but my first in Arkansas. This was in Prairie Grove, a small city in the northwestern part of the state. From my very first night there, I could tell there was something wrong with the place. I heard things, saw things that felt all too familiar. I knew I had moved into a dark, evil place, but I had no choice. I had spent all my money moving there and couldn't afford to leave, at least not until after this happened. It was October 2007, about 2 weeks before Halloween and my birthday. It was around 3 a.m. when I found myself craving some nachos. Since I couldn't sleep, I decided to drive to a 24-hour gas station just a few miles away to grab some. I got back in my car and drove home, nachos in hand, ready to enjoy them. But when I pulled into my parking space and turned off the car, something happened. I felt a chill, like a spike of frozen electricity shooting down my spine. Then I felt it. A force grabbed me, yanking me back into my seat as the car door slammed shut. I felt hands all over me, stroking me, rubbing me. It was trying to seduce me, or something even worse. What made it even more terrifying was that I was alone, completely alone in the car. There was nothing there, but I could feel it. I heard low growls and felt what seemed like claws gripping me, overpowering me. I tried to fight back, but it was too strong. I was fully dressed, but I could feel it penetrating me, viciously, over and over. The pain was excruciating, and I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed, trapped by this invisible force, and the fear that it would never end gripped me. It felt like only a few minutes had passed, but when it finally ended, I looked at the clock. It was nearly 5 a.m. Over an hour had passed. I don't understand how something that felt so short lasted so long. I managed to stumble inside my apartment and ran to the bathroom. I stared at myself in the mirror, questioning my sanity, wondering if it had all been a dream. But it felt so real. I checked myself for any marks or signs, but there was nothing. Still, the memory of what had happened was burned into my mind. I wish I could forget it. It was one of the most horrifying experiences of my life, and even now, I struggle to understand it. I work the 3rd shift at a local motel and have been here for over 7 months now. During the winter, I got used to the strange things that come with working overnight in a motel. Even being wide awake at 4 a.m. can feel eerie at times, but there are some things that just don't have an easy explanation. Like lights flashing in response to questions, vacant rooms suddenly springing to life with radios blaring at full volume, doors that feel like someone is holding them from the other side, and catching spirit orbs on security cameras and even my phone. One night, the exit sign lights started acting weird. At first, they blinked rapidly, then gradually slowed down to just a few blinks per minute. That night, my friend Tom stopped by while my wife, Kate, and I were having dinner at work. I was behind the desk when a flicker on the security monitor caught my attention. The exit sign on the south side of the building was blinking at us. At first, we brushed it off as a camera malfunction, but Tom, who's naturally curious and eccentric, asked the screen, "Can you see us?" The light shut off completely. Our eyes widened, and hearts raced as Tom nervously asked, "Do you want us to leave?" The light blinked rapidly in response. We finished our dinner in the lobby, trying to shake off what had just happened. Kate left, urging us to ignore it and not give it any more attention. But curiosity got the better of us. While Tom stayed behind the desk watching the monitors, I ventured upstairs to check things out. Walking down the hall toward the blinking light, I heard music coming from room 223, the room closest to the exit sign. When I checked the room log, I found that room 223 had been vacant for the past 3 days. With the master key in hand, Tom and I entered the room. It was freezing cold. We could see our breath in the air. The clock radio, which wasn't set to an alarm, was blasting music at almost full volume. We turned it off, checked everything, and left the room feeling uneasy. We tried to rationalize what had just happened as we headed back downstairs. About 20 minutes later, I decided to do a walk around of the building. I checked the lower floors and then moved to the stairwell opposite room 223. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I'm not one to run into things I can't move, so I planted my feet and gave it another push. The door opened about 2 inches and then stopped. It felt like something was holding it from the other side. I wrote it off as a coincidence, but it left me with an unsettling feeling. A few days later, Kate came back to have dinner with me again. After a while, we noticed the light on the security camera flashing again. This time, we decided to experiment. I asked Kate to go upstairs while I watched the security monitors. What I noticed was eerie. The light only blinked when she wasn't looking directly at it. We repeated this a few times with the same result. Spooked, we decided to leave it alone for a while. Months went by, and on a particularly stormy night, I noticed something else. I was sitting at my laptop when something moved on the security monitor. I leaned in closer and saw a glowing white orb moving erratically on the screen. It had an almost semicircular shape and moved in and out of the camera's view. I grabbed my phone and recorded the monitor. I still have the video. After about 10 minutes of watching this orb, I heard a solid thump from the back door. It wasn't a sharp knock, but more like someone throwing their shoulder against the door. A heavy, forceful sound. It happened 2 or 3 times, just enough to make me feel seriously uneasy. Since then, I've learned to expect the unexpected while working the night shift. But no matter how much time passes, some things just can't be explained. Throughout my life, I've had strange things happen to me in the middle of the night, but I always chalk them up to coincidences or figments of my imagination. I've always been spiritual, though I don't follow any specific denomination. I abide by Christian principles, but believe that, in essence, we all worship the same higher power. Whenever these odd events happened, I would pray, and eventually, I'd feel calm enough to go back to sleep. What I'm about to share may sound unbelievable to some, and I wouldn't have believed it myself if it hadn't happened to me. But now I have no doubt that there are forces, demonic or otherwise, that can affect our world. There was only one other time in my life that I truly felt the presence of a demon before this story. I was very young, on a camping trip with my family, and couldn't sleep. As I tossed and turned, I felt a chill creeping into the room, settling at the base of my neck. I closed my eyes hoping to block out the fear, but instead I saw something terrifying, a pair of demonic eyes. It's hard to describe exactly what they looked like, but they filled me with pure terror. I prayed, trying to calm myself down, but the more I prayed, the more scared I felt. Eventually I whispered, "Jesus loves me," and as I sang, the fear subsided. Suddenly, the overhead light in the camper flicked on. When I got up to turn it off, I saw that the switch was still in the off position. It had to be switched to on and back off again to turn it off. That was the first time I felt certain I had encountered something evil. The second time was much worse. It was December 2009, and I was 22 years old. My son was 11 months old, and my husband was working overnight shifts. I had just finished a semester of college, so I had some time off. 2 of my friends, Sarah and Jack, and I decided to take a trip to my parents' lake house in Greers Ferry, Arkansas, for a midweek getaway. On the way there, we passed a clearing that gave us a stunning view of the lake, shimmering under the moonlight. I motioned for Sarah, who was in the passenger seat, to take a look, but she seemed uneasy. When I asked what was wrong, she just whispered, "Nothing." I figured she was just spooking herself. Sarah had mentioned before that she could sense things, both good and evil, and that her dreams often came true. I didn't really believe in that stuff, though, so I brushed it off and turned up the music to distract her. When we arrived at the lake house, Sarah seemed to feel better, and we met up with Jack. We unpacked, assigned rooms, and settled in for the night. Sarah had originally planned to share a room with me and my son, but once we arrived, she changed her mind, saying she wanted her own space. I didn't think much of it at the time. Later that evening, my son, Chase, went to bed, but woke up screaming uncontrollably after just a few minutes. He was usually a good sleeper, so this was strange. I calmed him down and tried putting him back to bed, but he started crying again the moment we crossed the room's threshold. Sarah stayed with him while Jack and I ran to the store for groceries. When we got back, Sarah was frantic. Chase had cried non-stop the entire time, only calming down when she held him. As soon as she tried to put him to bed, he'd start screaming again. We eventually got him to sleep, and the three of us stayed up chatting and watching movies until about 1 a.m. We were all tired by then, so we went to bed. That's when things got really strange. I fell asleep quickly but soon found myself in a strange dream. I was in a bright room full of laughing people, but I didn't want to be there. I walked into another room, identical but empty, and sat down on the couch. When I looked into the glass-top coffee table, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't quite right. My reflection was asleep. I started banging on the table to wake it up, and when its eyes opened, they were bright red. The table shattered. I woke up with a chill running down my spine. It felt like something was in the room, watching me. My son started to whimper from his crib, and I'd never heard him sound so terrified, even though he was still asleep. I rolled onto my back, feeling a deep sense of dread. The door to my bedroom was open, and the shadow behind it was darker than normal, like a living presence. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I've dealt with sleep paralysis since I was a child, and that night, it hit me hard. Every time I closed my eyes, I slipped into REM sleep and found myself paralyzed. At one point, just after breaking out of the paralysis, I felt something sit on the corner of my bed. I sat up immediately, but nothing was there. Chase was still softly crying in his sleep. I called my dog, but she had hidden under the bed and wouldn't come out. That's when I knew something was very wrong. The shadow by the door seemed closer now, creeping toward the bed. I began to pray and sing under my breath, hoping to make it go away. Eventually, I felt a bit calmer, but then I felt a hot breath against my face. I opened my eyes, nothing was there, but that was enough for me. I grabbed Chase, called for my dog, and ran to Sarah's room. I woke her up, and when she saw my face, she didn't need to ask what was wrong. Together, we moved Chase's crib into her room, but as we tried to close her door, it wouldn't shut. It was as if something was pulling the door from the other side. Eventually, we managed to get it closed and locked. Sarah confided that the reason she hadn't wanted to sleep in my room was because it scared her for reasons she couldn't explain. She also recalled a dream from the night before, in which she had driven through the forest, past a lake, and into a mass of trees that turned into the mouth of a demon. We prayed together and tried to get some rest. The next morning, things seemed better, until I went back into the bedroom to grab a diaper. As I walked back out, Chase, who was in my arms, looked over my shoulder and started laughing hysterically. I turned around. Nothing was there. Needless to say, I didn't go back into that room for the rest of the day. Later that day, I felt an unusual sense of anger building inside me. I yelled at Chase to shut up, something I had never done before and haven't done since. Sarah, worried about me, told me to take a nap, and after some rest, I felt better. That night, the smoke alarm by the bedroom went off, despite there being no smoke. We laughed it off nervously, but we were all scared. Jack offered to stay with me that night, so we slept in the room next to the one that scared me. As we were drifting off, we heard a loud crash outside the door. When we checked, the bedroom door was wide open, swinging back and forth as if it had slammed into the wall. We all talked about our experiences with the supernatural, sharing stories about God and angels. At one point, Sarah and I both realized at the same moment. The presence was gone. A weight I hadn't even noticed before was lifted, and I finally felt at peace. I believe the demon followed me home, though much milder things happened after that. I told it that I was a child of God, and it wasn't welcome in my life or my son's life. Since then, I haven't felt that dark presence or the overwhelming fear I used to experience. I'm 41 years old now, but my experience dates back to when I was 13. It was the last week of the school year, and I was walking home when I was stopped by an old man standing by the side of the road. He asked me if I wanted to make some money by helping him top a tree at the end of his driveway, where he usually parked. Curious, I shook the man's hand and asked him about the tools I'd be using. He simply said, "Follow me," and started walking around to the back of the house. He opened an old, half-broken tool shed and began pulling out tools for me to use. As I got back to the tree, I noticed two of my schoolmates walking down the hill, past the old man's house. I asked them if they wanted to help me with the tree, and one of them, Harold, agreed. The other friend declined and kept walking. We got to work, trimming and topping the tree, while the old man started talking about praying, God, and religion. He told us there was a specific way to pray, and I asked if he was a preacher. He said no, but he shared his advice about prayer. He suggested finding a big rock out in the woods, sitting on it, and having a conversation with God. Just you, the rock, and God. After a few hours of work, we finally finished. The old man seemed relieved and told us that he'd been trying to finish topping that tree for years, but was too old to do it alone. He handed me $2 for my work, and though it wasn't much, I took it. As we stood there talking, a car pulled up into the driveway, and an older woman stepped out, looking upset. She stormed over and asked, "What are you two doing in my driveway, messing with my tree?" I told her we were helping the old man top the tree. She looked confused and asked, "What old man?" I gestured to the man standing beside me and said, "This old man right here." She stared at me, looking pale, and then asked, "What's his name?" I turned to the old man and asked for his name. He replied, "Otis." The woman's face turned white, and she collapsed to the ground, unconscious. I rushed over to help her while my friend ran to call for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived and revived her, they asked what had happened. The woman, still shaken, said, "Otis was my husband. He died while topping that tree 11 years ago." She showed us a picture of him, and sure enough, it was the same old man who had been standing beside me. But when we turned to look, the man was gone, vanished without a trace. It's been 26 years since that day, and I've never seen the old man again. Maybe his job was finally done, and he was able to move on. This story takes place at my parents' house in Fayetteville, Arkansas, back when I was a senior in high school. We had just moved into this house after living in North Carolina for a few years. The house was relatively new, only about 5 years old, and located in an average neighborhood. At first, there didn't seem to be anything unusual about it. The house was bright and sunny, with a pleasant atmosphere, but something felt different at night, especially in the living room. It sat at the center of the house, between the kitchen and the master and guest bedrooms, and it seemed to amplify every sound. My parents let me have the larger guest bedroom, which was right next to theirs. It had a large window that overlooked the front lawn and a high ceiling. It felt spacious and inviting, at least during the day. The first odd thing I remember happening was in broad daylight. It was a lazy Sunday morning, and I was reading a book, using a small brass bookmark that my grandmother had given me. The bookmark had my name engraved on it, and I kept it tucked in the book on my desk. I had placed the book down and walked to my closet to decide what to wear for the day, when suddenly I heard a loud crack above me. I felt something hit my shoulder. It was my brass bookmark. I was completely puzzled. I had just placed it on my desk moments ago. I told my parents, but they shrugged it off and blamed it on my little sister, who was asleep at the time. After that, I started keeping the other strange things that happened to myself. Every few nights, I'd hear things falling off my desk, waking me up. The items always seemed stable before I went to bed, but I constantly found myself staring out of my open bedroom door at night, feeling like I wasn't alone. Eventually, I started sleeping with my door closed, and the disturbances stopped. For a while, things were quiet, but then new noises began. I started waking up to faint, strange sounds near my bedroom door. Sometimes it sounded like quiet whimpering, and other times it was more like scratching at the base of the door, almost as if a small dog wanted to come inside. I never opened the door. I figured that if something was out there, I'd rather not invite it into the room with me. The reason I'm sharing this story now, after all these years, is because of a recent visit home that scared me more than anything else. I had gone off to college, and the strange occurrences seemed to stop once I left. But during my last visit for spring break, something happened that brought it all back. I was staying in my old bedroom, And since I had gotten used to sleeping with my door open again, I left it open that night. At around 3 a.m., I woke up with a deep sense of dread. I glanced at the doorway and saw a large, black German shepherd standing there, staring directly at me. At first, I thought it was my dog, Kipcha, who is also a large shepherd mix. But it wasn't her. This dog was different. Its presence was unnerving. It just stood there for a few seconds, staring at me before turning around and disappearing. I haven't seen anything like that since, but the experience left me shaken. After doing some research, I came across something called a black shuck, a mythical black dog said to be an omen of death. I really hope that's not the case. I also looked up the house on Google Earth, and it seems that the previous owners had dogs, though they appeared to be small breeds. I'm not sure what I saw that night, or what to make of all the strange things that happened in that house. I'd love to know what you think. This event completely removed any skepticism I had about the paranormal. Here's what happened. It was back in 1993, and I was driving home with my girlfriend after a late-night date at the movies. It was a cold but clear January night. No clouds, no fog, just a calm winter evening. The time was about 12:30 a.m., and as we approached a hill on the highway, I moved into the slow lane. That's when it happened. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a man in the middle of my lane. He was dressed in a white t-shirt, blue jeans, tennis shoes, and a red baseball cap. He had his head down and was walking briskly, hands in his pockets. The thing is, he wasn't just far off in the distance. He was right there, no more than 20 or 30 feet in front of the car, directly in the middle of my lane. I was driving about 45 miles per hour, and it looked like I was going to hit him. Before I could react or even hit the brakes, my girlfriend screamed. Instinctively, I shut my eyes, slammed on the brakes, and entered into a skid. The car screeched to a stop, and I could feel chills and shivers run through my entire body. Pure terror. My girlfriend kept screaming, completely hysterical. When the car finally stopped, it was dead silent, except for our frantic breathing. Inside the car, it was freezing cold. I could see my breath, and the windows were covered in condensation, even though just moments earlier the heater had been keeping us warm and comfortable. Sure, it was about 25 degrees outside, but we had been driving for over half an hour, and the car had been warm the entire time, until now. To make matters worse, the battery seemed drained. The headlights were dim, and the car wouldn't start for a couple of minutes. When it finally did, I didn't waste any time. I sped off, driving as fast as I could to get us home. My girlfriend was still in shock, too hysterical to speak. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she said something that chilled me even more. She swore that we had hit the man, but instead of being thrown by the impact, he walked through the car. She told this same story to her pastor, my family, and hers. We were so shaken that we returned to the spot later that night, bringing a few friends with us to make sure we hadn't hit and killed anyone. But there was no one. No sign of an accident, no body. Everything was normal. This was during my college years, and for a long time, I didn't talk about the incident. But now, at 40 years old, it feels just as fresh in my memory as if it happened yesterday. I know it sounds like one of those stories you see on TV, but I can assure you, it happened. I saw, felt, and experienced something I still can't explain. It changed the way I think about the spirit world. And to this day, I'm still trying to figure out what it was that we encountered that night. Interestingly enough, I've heard of 2 other people having the exact same experience in that same spot on the road. No one seems to know who the figure is or if there was ever an accident that might explain it. What I do know is that the hill is known for being dangerous, with several fatal car accidents over the years. That's all I've been able to find out. Since that night, I've had a couple of other experiences with the paranormal, but none as up close and personal as this one. I still have to drive that stretch of highway every day to and from work, and not a trip goes by where I don't think about that encounter. I guess I should consider myself lucky that whatever that entity was, it didn't attach itself to me or follow me home. All of the following events took place in my old house in Arkansas, where I lived with my parents, Bob and Sarah, and my older brother Joey. My parents have since moved out, and tragically, Joey was killed in a car accident 5 years ago. Now I live in Texas, but I'll never forget the experiences I had in that house, especially my encounters with what I believe was my guardian angel. The first time I remember encountering this presence, I was 5 years old. I was sitting at the top of the stairs, my legs dangling over the edge, when I suddenly heard a soft whisper in my ear. The voice, sweet and gentle, said, "Be careful, sweetie. Don't fall down the stairs." It was a woman's voice, and although I didn't think much of it at the time, being 5 years old, I replied aloud, "I won't." But who said that? There was no answer. My mother, who was in the kitchen, heard me talking and came out, asking who I was speaking to. I told her, "I don't know." She just shrugged it off, assuming I was talking to my brother, as she told me later. But I knew I had heard something. The next time I encountered this mysterious voice, I was 12. It was summer, and my brother and I were in the backyard, soaking each other with buckets of water to cool off. Behind our house was a large, overgrown field where the local teenagers often hung out, drinking or making out. The field was littered with broken glass from smashed bottles, and my mother always warned us never to walk barefoot in that area. As my brother and I played, I soaked him with water and quickly hopped over the fence into the field to escape him. In my rush, one of my sneakers slipped off and landed back in our yard. Being a lazy 12-year-old, I decided to keep going without it, thinking I could just avoid the glass. I zigzagged through the field, not paying close attention to my steps, when I suddenly saw a white mist ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. And then I heard that same female voice again. The same voice I had heard when I was 5. This time she simply said, "Look down." I obeyed, and right there, beneath my bare foot, were 2 smashed bottles. If I had taken even one more step, I would have cut my feet to pieces. My heart raced as I mumbled a quick, "Thank you," to the mist and ran back to the house as fast as I could. From that moment on, I was convinced I had a guardian angel watching over me, and I still believe it to this day. In 2005, I opened a day spa just around the corner from the historic district in Conway. We launched in the first week of December, and about a week before Christmas, strange things started happening. At first, we heard items being moved around in rooms where no one was present. The house had been built in the early 1900s, so I tried to brush it off as the house settling. But soon it became clear that something more was going on. One of the rooms had a light that I always made sure to turn off at closing. Yet when I'd come in the next morning, it would be on. At first, I thought maybe my mom was coming in and leaving it on, but when I asked, she said she hadn't been in at all. Then, in June of 2006, things escalated. My mom was in the shop with a client named Danny when she called me asking why I hadn't come in to say hello. I told her I hadn't returned to work after I left earlier. That's when she told me both she and Danny heard the doors open and close twice. Danny confirmed that they had both thought I had come back in. Most of the strange occurrences seemed to happen at the same times each year, with little things happening sporadically. In early 2007, I was working late with a client named Anne and was telling her about some of the strange things that had been going on. After finishing her pedicure, I tried to drain the water from the tub, but the pump wouldn't turn on. I told Anne I'd try again in a little while. When I went back 45 minutes later, the water was gone. Even though the pump still wasn't working, Anne and I laughed and joked that the ghost must be a girl, because a boy wouldn't have bothered with it. Throughout 2007, lights would turn on by themselves and things would be mysteriously moved around. But the week before Christmas, the activity really ramped up. The ghost became a regular topic of conversation among staff and clients. One girl, Lauren, laughed and said, "You guys are funny. There's no ghost here." But she changed her tune about an hour later. Lauren had gone to the other side of the building when she came back, her eyes wide as silver dollars. She said she had been shoved and was visibly shaken. After that, she never doubted the presence of a ghost in the shop again. Fast forward to February 2008. I was working with Lee and a client named Betty when we both heard the sound of Lee's clippers turning on. I didn't think much of it, assuming Lee was cleaning them. But about 5 minutes later, Lee came into the room and asked if I had turned them on. I told her I thought she was using them, but she hadn't even been to her station yet. In October 2009, my mother was in the shop late one night, around 10 p.m., reorganizing things. She was in the kitchen when she felt like someone was watching her. She said there was a lot of noise in the building, and after the unsettling feeling in the kitchen, she decided to leave. Then, in December of 2009, my 2.5-year-old granddaughter, Ashlyn, came to the shop and needed to use the bathroom, the same one where Lauren had her encounter almost a year earlier. When Ashlyn came out, she was scared. She told me the scary was back there. I asked her to show me, but she wouldn't go down the hall again. When I finally convinced her to go with me, she stopped dead in her tracks, pointed, and said, "It's right there." I couldn't see anything, but she clearly did. I asked her what it looked like, and she kept saying, "It's black and has no eyes." Even now, at 4 years old, she tells the story like it happened yesterday. Another employee, Ashley, had a digital clock plugged into the wall, and almost every time she came in, the time had been changed. It only happened to her clock. Ashley also once saw someone sitting in a chair, but when she turned to look again, the figure was gone. Jonna, a massage therapist who worked with us, also confided in me that she often felt like she was being watched. During my sophomore year of high school, my parents made the decision to start a new business, which meant we had to move. It wasn't far, only about 40 miles from the town I grew up in, but as a teenager it felt like I was being uprooted and taken 300 miles away. The house we moved into had an unusual backstory. The previous owner, a divorced mother of 2, could no longer afford the mortgage and was forced to sell. We bought their house, and they bought ours. We visited the house several times before the move, and I met her 2 kids, Eric, who was 12, and Laura, who was 14. Eric seemed like a normal kid, but Laura was a different story. She was the epitome of an angry teenager, lashing out at everyone, especially her mother. I remember her showing me her bedroom, and with a scowl she said, "This might be where you end up sleeping, but it'll always be my room." Later, when they visited our house, I took Laura for a walk around the neighborhood. She wasted no time telling me how much she hated the area, calling it podunk, and saying she couldn't wait to leave. I didn't want to move either, but I told her it was just how things were. 7 months passed in our new home, and I had settled in. I made friends, got a job, and even started dating someone. One weekend, my boyfriend and I went to a small lake about 20 miles away. It was a fun day, but as the weather turned, we quickly packed up and headed home. A few miles down the road, we came to a sudden stop. There had been a horrific car accident just minutes before we arrived. Sirens wailed as emergency vehicles rushed to the scene. A small red pickup had run a red light and been hit by a larger truck going 55 miles per hour. The scene was chaotic, and to my horror, right next to me, I saw men taking photos of something in a ditch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the top of a girl's skull, exact with long brown hair. I was shaken to my core. When I got home, I told my mother what I had seen. I barely slept that night. The next morning, my mom came in and told me that Laura had been killed in the accident. I was in shock. It was her. After the funeral, life slowly returned to normal, or so I thought. A month or so passed, and I began to let go of the trauma I had witnessed that day. But then the strange things started happening. One night, I woke up suddenly, feeling a presence in my room. I had a daybed at the time, and I was facing the wall. I felt something lying beside the bed, stretching the entire length of it. I was convinced there was a casket next to me, and though I refused to turn over and look, I could feel its presence. I lay there in fear for hours, too terrified to move until I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. I didn't tell anyone about it. I thought my mother would think I was crazy. Over the following months, smaller things started happening. Every time I went up the stairs, I felt someone following me. Lights flickered on and off by themselves. The garage door would sound like it was opening, but when I checked, it hadn't moved. Doors would slam shut on their own, windows opened without explanation, and drinking glasses would shatter in my hand for no reason. Objects I left on tables would disappear for hours and then reappear in the same spot. My dog would sit up in bed at night, barking toward a corner of the room. I was terrified of being in that house, but I felt like I couldn't tell anyone. One day, a male friend came over, and we were getting ready to head out to a local event. As I was getting ready, he played with the dog. When I came back, he looked uneasy and bluntly said, "There's someone here with us. I can feel them. I want to leave." And leave we did. Quickly. That's when I finally told him about the strange things I'd been experiencing. The most terrifying experience happened one night when a guy I had briefly dated showed up unexpectedly. He was pushy and clingy, and I didn't want to see him, but I let him in for a quick chat. After a few minutes, I gave him several hints that he needed to leave, but he didn't get the message. So, I went upstairs to take a shower, hoping he would get the hint and leave on his own. When I came back downstairs, I found him in the middle of the living room, mopping up a spilled glass of water. He looked shaken and angry. He asked, "Why didn't you answer me when you were in the hallway?" He was referring to the foyer just outside the living room. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. He then explained that he had seen me, or what he thought was me, moving through the hallway, flitting back and forth, disappearing as he tried to follow. He said I even scared him by suddenly appearing behind the couch, causing him to drop his glass. When I told him I had been upstairs the whole time, his face turned pale. He left shortly after that, and so did I. I wasn't staying there alone. This went on for years. While I somewhat got used to it, I hated the feeling of being watched and unwelcome in my own home. Years later, I finally confided in my mother about everything that had happened. She looked guilty as she told me she had experienced similar things. She said she believed it was Laura taunting me, trying to let me know that it was her room and always would be. My mother had even seen her a couple of times and told her to leave because she was scaring me. But no matter what we did, nothing seemed to make her pass on. That experience solidified my belief in the paranormal. Before living in that house, I wasn't sure if I believed in spirits or ghosts. But after those years of unexplained events, I became a firm believer. Laura never let me forget that my bedroom was hers, and in a way, it always will be. I was born in 1981, not in a big city or a small, remote town, but a medium-sized place in the desert. I was born to loving parents, my father's second child and my mother's first. My older half-sibling didn't live with us because my father's first wife had custody. 2 years later, my younger brother was born, and we became a close-knit family. My parents were what my brother and I affectionately called hippies. They never denied it and would even laugh and brag when we called them that. I was conceived in an old VW van, where my mom carried me for the first 8 months of her pregnancy. Just before I was born, my father had saved enough from his job to rent an apartment. It was small but cozy, and just a month and a half later, I was born. 2 weeks overdue. My birth wasn't easy. My mother wanted a natural birth, but by the time labor began, I had already grown too large. After hours of intense labor, the doctors decided to perform an emergency C-section. Both my mom and I almost didn't make it. As the story goes, I entered the world screaming, bald, and a bit overweight. The birth process had been so difficult that my head was cone-shaped from the pressure. It took nearly a year for my skull to settle into a normal shape. 2 weeks later, my parents finally brought me home. They were so excited about my arrival that they didn't realize they hadn't prepared a crib or anything for me to sleep in. So for the first 2.5 months, I slept with them in their waterbed. That's where the first unusual event of my life happened. One night, my parents had put me in bed as usual, and after a long day, they fell asleep quickly. But I wasn't asleep. I started crying, and no matter what they did, I wouldn't stop. Frustrated, my dad suggested they take me for a car ride, hoping it would calm me down. So they bundled me up, got dressed, and took me on a drive. By the time they returned, I was fast asleep. Relieved, they put me back in bed and went to sleep. At around 3 a.m., my parents were jolted awake by my screams. My mom quickly turned on the light, but when they looked for me, I wasn't where they had left me. Panic set in as they searched. My dad finally found me on his side of the bed, hanging halfway off, with my legs stuck between the waterbed frame and the mattress. He reached for me, but as he did, he noticed something strange. He knew it was me, but for a moment, he said, it felt like he didn't recognize me. As he carefully pulled my leg free, the bedroom door suddenly slammed shut on its own. My mother stood frozen, terrified, while my father rushed to free me. They immediately drove me to the hospital, where it was discovered that my leg was broken, from my hip to my knee. The doctors were suspicious and called in the police, but after an investigation, no charges were filed. There was no explanation for how my leg had gotten trapped between the bed frame or how I had managed to get to the other side of the bed without making a sound. At that age, I wasn't even able to crawl yet. My parents later reflected on that night, realizing it might have been my first encounter with something otherworldly. After that night, my parents couldn't bear to stay in the apartment, so they moved 2 states east. They ended up living in a camper for a while, moving from place to place, while I was sent to live with my grandparents for a few months while my leg healed. Over the next year and a half, I went back and forth between my parents and grandparents. Once I learned to walk, my behavior started to change. I became quiet and withdrawn. I didn't like being around people, and I would often find places to hide, sometimes for hours, without making a sound. I developed an odd habit of turning on lights at all hours of the day and night. At night, I would hide behind furniture or in corners, never making a peep. My family thought it was strange, but they didn't know what to make of it. One day, while I was napping behind the wood stove at my grandparents' house, my grandmother found me and moved me to the couch. Just as she was walking away, I started to have a nightmare. She turned back to check on me, and at that exact moment, a picture frame flew off the wall, crossed the room, and gashed her arm. She still has a scar from that incident, and 7 people were in the room to witness it. It was the first time my family began to realize that something unexplainable was happening. As I got older, things only became more unsettling. I never had an imaginary friend, but I would scream and cry at what seemed like nothing. My parents decided to take me to a child therapist. The therapist asked me to draw pictures and talk about what I was feeling. When asked why I screamed and cried, I told him, "He isn't my imaginary friend." The therapist asked who I was talking about, and I replied, "He wants to kill the world." That night, I had a terrifying dream where I saw something that felt like it wanted to destroy everything. The voice in my dream whispered, "I'll take you." When I was 20, I asked my parents about that dream, and they told me they had heard those same words come out of my mouth that night, but it wasn't in my voice. The strange occurrences seemed to calm down for a while. My brother was born, and we moved again, this time to a small house. But the peace didn't last long. Soon after we moved, my parents started hearing footsteps at night. The sounds of heavy boots would stomp up and down the hallway, but when my father searched the house with a gun, he found nothing. This went on for several nights, and each time, the footsteps would stop right at the door to the master bedroom. One night, my father fired shots, convinced there was an intruder, but no one was there. The next day, we packed up and moved again. But even after we left, the footsteps followed us for 6 months. Wherever we went, we could hear them, faint at first, then louder and more aggressive. It took half a year before they finally stopped. For a time, we thought the worst was over, but I would soon learn that this was only the beginning. When I was 13, we moved into an old house in a larger town. The house had thick plaster walls and wooden floors that creaked with every step. It was there that I started seeing shadows, figures that moved quickly, disappearing just as fast as they appeared. Sometimes they had vague human shapes, but they were mostly formless. I would see them darting around our house, and occasionally, I would feel them watching me. One night, as my family sat in the living room watching TV, my younger brother suddenly got up and walked toward the front door. He seemed dazed, as if he wasn't fully awake. He turned the knob, but the door was locked. My parents watched in confusion as he struggled with the door. Then he turned around and said, "I'll take this one too," in a voice that wasn't his own. The house shook as he said those words, and my mother grabbed him, pulling him away from the door. The same eerie laughter we had heard years ago echoed through the house. It was the same sound we heard the night our previous house burned down. After that, we moved again, leaving everything behind. The nightmares and strange encounters would follow us for years. I eventually learned to live with them, but they left a mark on me, shaping my belief in the supernatural. To this day, I still think about those early years and wonder what it was that haunted my family. I'll start by saying this. The very last place I ever expected to see anything paranormal was in a public corporate store. Up until that point, my experiences with the supernatural were limited to fleeting glimpses, nothing solid enough to warrant a full story. Maybe the most notable one before this was the time I walked straight into a ghostly, bearded face in the dead of night as I crossed from the living room to the kitchen. That was creepy enough, but you're here to hear about the Walmart ghost. Now, this didn't happen in Oregon, where I currently live. This all took place in Arkansas. I found myself in Arkansas because after a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend, I refused to watch him get on that plane and leave for another year. We'd met online over World of Warcraft, but he lived 7 states away, and for 4 years we made things work. He finally came to visit, but after he left, I knew I had to go back with him. I even took a term off school to make it happen. I could only stay for 3 months though, so I made it my mission to get a job as quickly as I could, save up, and bring us both back home together. This is where Walmart enters the picture. I wasn't planning on working at Walmart, especially since, in Oregon, it's not exactly a store people love. It's known for killing local businesses, and I wanted to avoid it. But circumstances led me there, specifically a temporary job remodeling the store. It paid more than the regular employees were getting, and it was straightforward. Reorganizing shelves, cleaning, replacing labels, basic stuff. What I didn't expect was that this mundane job would lead to one of the strangest experiences of my life. It started one morning while I was on the floor, tidying up a section of shelves, ripping off old labels, and polishing the surfaces. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing movement. Every time I turned to look, no one was there. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But it kept happening, quick flashes in my peripheral vision, enough to make me turn and check again. Nothing. The more it happened, the more I started to feel like something or someone was there. It was becoming a reflex. I'd catch a glimpse, whip my head around, and find no one. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I finally decided to try and watch without fully turning my head, to see if I could catch whatever it was out of the corner of my eye. Over time, I started to realize what I was seeing. It was a woman, or at least a figure, in a bright orange shirt with long, curly brown hair. She was always facing away from me. I don't recall seeing her legs. Maybe there was a faint gray smudge beneath the orange shirt, but I wasn't focused on that. Every time I tried to follow her or get a better look, she would disappear. I even prowled the aisles, looking for anyone wearing orange, but I was the only one there. Eventually, my supervisor interrupted my search and called me for lunch. As I sat outside eating, I mulled over what I had seen. None of my coworkers or supervisors had been wearing orange, and I hadn't seen any customers dressed that way either. Out in the open air, things felt normal again, and I started to convince myself that I was just hungry, or that maybe the cleaning chemicals had messed with my head. After lunch, I was assigned to the women's hosiery and lingerie section, organizing stockings and underwear. Once again, I was working alone, replacing tags and straightening the shelves. That's when I started seeing her again, the woman in the orange shirt. This time, she appeared off to my left, near a row of nylon leggings. I caught glimpses of her more frequently now, and at one point, I even saw her standing next to someone in a white shirt. But when I turned to look, no one was there. Frustrated and more than a little creeped out, I decided to investigate. Maybe there was something I was supposed to find. I walked over to the shelf where I kept seeing her, kneeling down to clean off the dusty metal framework. That's when I spotted something, crumpled paper tucked underneath the shelf. Puzzled, I reached for it. The moment I touched it, I realized it wasn't just any paper. It was tissue paper, soft and delicate, something that didn't belong in that part of the store. As I stood up, holding the crumpled paper in my hands, a strange chill ran through me. With growing trepidation, I unfolded it. Written in cursive, over and over again was the same phrase, "A day lived without laughter is a day lost." I felt a deep, eerie calm settle over me. Somehow, I knew that whatever message Mrs. Orange Shirt and her white-shirted counterpart had been trying to communicate, this was it. After that, I never saw either of them again. It was as if they had delivered their message, and their presence was no longer needed. That phrase stuck with me. It made me realize how much stress I had been under, worrying about my future, my relationship, and the overwhelming pressure to make everything perfect. The message was simple but profound, telling me to let go, to laugh, and to live in the moment. I'm back in Oregon now, and my boyfriend is with me, just as I had hoped. I often think about the woman in the orange shirt, and though I'll never know for sure who she was or why she appeared, I like to believe she was connected to me in some way, maybe a long-lost relative, or perhaps just a wandering spirit. Either way, her message was clear, and it's one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It all started when I was about 10 years old. At the time, I lived in a house in Arkansas, and though nothing unusual had ever happened before, things began to change. I can't pinpoint anything that might have triggered the experience, but I know that I didn't do anything to invite it. One day I was walking down to the basement to grab something. I can't even remember what, when I suddenly felt a chill. The air got heavy, and I had this overwhelming feeling that someone or something was watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes scanning the shadows. My heart started racing, and before I knew it, fear overtook me. I bolted up the stairs without even grabbing what I went down for. That feeling of being watched never left me after that. It followed me for years. When I turned 11, things escalated. It wasn't just feelings anymore. I started seeing things, shadows. At first, it was only out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure in a black cloak staring at me. Sometimes I'd walk past a dark room with the lights off and see the figure again, its back turned to me, just standing there, looking out the window. I never saw its face, but its presence was always unsettling. Even worse, every time I took out the trash at night, I could feel it behind me, like it was following me through the darkness. By the time I was 12 and 13, things had taken a turn for the worse. The house itself began acting strangely. Doors would creak open or slowly close by themselves. My parents brushed it off, saying it was just a draft, but I knew better. It felt like the house was alive, and it was watching me. One evening, when I was 13, something terrifying happened. I was home alone, sitting on the couch watching a movie. Out of nowhere, one of the small pillows next to me flew across the room. It didn't just fall. It shot off the couch with force and landed on the floor on the other side of the room. My heart leaped into my throat. I stared at the pillow for what felt like forever, trying to rationalize what had just happened. But deep down, I knew I couldn't explain it. A few months later, I had another frightening experience, this time in my bedroom. I was sitting at my desk, doing nothing in particular, when a sudden wave of terror washed over me, an indescribable fear, like something was right there with me. I froze, barely able to breathe. That's when I heard it, shuffling sounds like someone was moving just outside my door. The noise wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, for what felt like 5 minutes, not knowing what to do. I couldn't leave. Whatever it was just on the other side of the door. I waited, my heart pounding, until the fear finally began to fade. When I could move again, I bolted for the door and ran. But the worst experience happened not long after that. It was late one night, around 3 a.m. I had been listening to some cassette tapes, but I decided it was time to go to bed. I turned off the tape player and pulled up the covers, ready to sleep. That's when I felt it, a sudden chill that ran down my spine. And then I saw them. From the darkness of my closet, transparent figures started to emerge. They didn't walk like normal people. They shuffled, almost like zombies. At least 10 of them, all in a single file line, walked out of my closet and straight toward my bed. But the terrifying thing was, I sleep on the top bunk. These things were right in front of my face, their ghostly forms moving in slow, deliberate motions. They were wearing modern clothes, but I couldn't make out any details, just vague shapes and figures all pressing toward me. Something inside me snapped. I sat bolt upright in bed, and just like that, the figures vanished. But something was still there. I looked toward my closet, and that's when I saw it, something darker than the others. It looked like one of the figures, but it was black, its form hanging by the neck with its arms chained. It twisted and writhed in the air, moving as though it was in pain. It struggled for a while, then slumped over and disappeared back into the shadows. As soon as it was gone, I jumped out of bed. I didn't even use the ladder. I just leaped down and slammed the closet door shut, shoving a chair in front of it for good measure. After that night, the encounter stopped. I don't know what happened or why, but I've never had another issue with ghosts since. There's only one thing that still bothers me. Why was I the only one who ever experienced it? I never told my parents or siblings about what I saw, and no one else seemed to notice anything strange. But one thing's for sure, I'll always sleep with the closet door shut. This experience happened when I was around 9 or 10 years old. I don't remember my exact age, but I remember every second of that night vividly, as if it happened yesterday. To set the scene, let me give you a little background on my parents' house. It wasn't new by any means. In fact, it was about 120 years old when my parents bought it, which isn't uncommon for Sacramento. We lived in one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, and the house had seen its fair share of families come and go over the years. The layout was simple, a typical 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom bungalow. My room was in the front of the house, just to the left of the family room. There was a long hallway where the other rooms branched off, and at the end of the hall was the bathroom I shared with my siblings. Along with our modest home, we had an extraordinary dog named Butterscotch, though we called him Scotch for short. He was a loyal German shepherd, always at my side, day or night, almost like it was his personal duty to protect me. He'd either sleep in my room or just outside my door in the family room, never far from me. One night, in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. Pretty standard for a kid, especially since I was one of those who'd ignore the need, as long as I could, to avoid interrupting whatever play or dream I was absorbed in. So I finally got up, and as I made my way down the hallway, I could hear the familiar sound of Scotch's nails clattering on the hardwood floor behind me. It was pitch dark, but I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to wake anyone up, and I figured I could manage well enough, as I'd done plenty of times before. After finishing in the bathroom, I turned off the light and opened the door. As I made my way back down the hallway, just as I passed the turn that led to the basement, I saw Scotch laying right there on the hallway floor. I thought nothing of it at first, just figured my eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could finally see him more clearly. "Come on, Scotch, let's go back to bed," I whispered, but he didn't move. He just lay there, completely still. After a moment, I tried again to get him to follow me, but he wouldn't budge. Annoyed, I stepped over him and kept walking, thinking maybe he'd come once I was back in my room. Then, about 20 feet down the hall, something caught my eye. I froze, and my eyes adjusted again. Coming towards me from the living room was Scotch, my actual dog. It took less than 2 seconds for me to process what was happening. I bolted down the hallway, threw myself into bed, and yanked the covers over my head, my heart pounding. I realized there was no way it could have been Scotch laying in the hall. He wasn't exactly the stealthy type. There's no way he could have gotten past me without me hearing or seeing him. As I lay there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I couldn't shake the image of that dog in the hallway. It wasn't Scotch. Even in the darkness, I could tell. It had this faint, almost glowing green outline around it, and it was smaller, maybe around 50 pounds, while Scotch was a solid 80 pounds. The figure had a pit bull-like appearance, not my big, loyal German shepherd. How I'd confused them in those moments, I still don't know. For years after, I never told anyone about that night. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Heck, I wasn't even sure I believed what I had seen. Then, a few years later, we were cleaning out the basement. Our basement was divided into 2 sections, a normal, concrete-floored basement and a dirt floor section that had once been used as a wine cellar. We mostly used that part for storage. While cleaning, I came across something that sent chills through me. Bones. They were too big to belong to a rat or a cat. My mind immediately flashed back to that night. I was almost certain these bones belonged to the dog I'd seen. I never told anyone about the bones or my encounter, mostly because I knew a lot of people don't believe animals have spirits or energy the way people do. But after that experience, I'm convinced they do. I know they do. It all started when I found this house on Craigslist. The moment I saw it, I felt an instant connection. I can't really explain it, but it felt like the house was meant for me. I showed it to my mom, and she loved it too. So naturally, we moved in. The house was old, about 100 years old, but that only added to its charm for me, and I had to have the upstairs bedroom. It used to be the attic, so the entire upper floor was one big room, and I couldn't resist it. The only thing that gave me pause was the fact that there were two smaller attic spaces attached to the room, one accessible through the roof and the other through a door. I also had to share the room with my sister, and of course, she made me take the side with both attics, the creepier side. In addition to the attics, there were these 4 small compartments, just big enough to sit up in and move around, but not big enough to stand. They were part of the attic too, and their presence only added to the eerie vibe of the room. The first few nights we stayed in the house, I slept in the living room downstairs. One morning, I woke up early and saw someone walk through the dining room. It was a quick glimpse, and at first, I thought it was my little brother on his way to the bathroom. But when I checked his room, he was sound asleep, and so was everyone else. That's when I got a little creeped out, but I brushed it off and turned on the TV to distract myself. A few nights later, my sister started complaining about a bright orb in our room. It was small, but really bright, hovering near my closet. Then, on another night, my mom saw the same kind of orb, but this time in the living room. My nerves were starting to get the better of me, especially after my mom mentioned hearing footsteps in the dining room at night while everyone was asleep. At one point, the previous owner of the house came by to pick up some things from the yard, so naturally, we asked if he'd ever had any paranormal experiences. His response sent chills down my spine. He said there was one recurring thing. Every time he'd pull into the driveway, he'd see a girl staring out the upstairs window. The unsettling part? The girl looked exactly like me. He'd go upstairs to check, but no one was ever there. That's when I started to wonder, was it just a coincidence that I felt such a strong connection to this house, and specifically to that room, the same room where a girl that looked like me had been seen staring out the windows? There were other strange occurrences as well. One night, we had company over, and we heard a loud crash coming from the laundry room. When we went to check, we found everything in the middle of the room, completely out of place. Our guest was so freaked out that she slept with salt beside her bed, convinced it would protect her. But things really escalated on Memorial Day night. My little brother was terrified, saying something had grabbed his leg while he was in bed. We thought he was making it up, so we sent him back to bed. About 10 minutes later, he called for our older sister, and this time she came running down the hallway, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Mom, help! I hear it! It's coming from your room." My mom and I rushed over, but by the time we got there, the house was completely silent. We didn't hear a thing. We calmed my brother down and sent him upstairs to our room, hoping he'd fall asleep. But 10 minutes later, he called for help again, this time using the walkie-talkie. My sister and her boyfriend ran upstairs, and my brother said he heard scratching coming from the walls, starting on the opposite side of the room and getting closer to him. Then the light started flickering, and to top it off, the roof panel leading to the attic was cracked open. My brother swore it had opened by itself, and given how high up it was, there was no way he could have reached it. That's when things started feeling serious. I stayed upstairs with him until everyone else was ready for bed. Meanwhile, my mom and sister went to check my little brother's room. Inside, they found an empty water bottle rolling across the floor, back and forth, as if moved by something invisible. Then suddenly, it started spinning and landed with its point facing directly at my mom. Without hesitation, my mom kicked the bottle and shouted, "I'm not afraid of you." Later that night, my sister and her boyfriend came up to our room to sleep, but none of us could relax. We kept hearing faint conversations coming from downstairs. My sister's boyfriend went down to check, but everyone was sound asleep. He came back upstairs, and just as we thought things were quieting down, we heard a door slam. But no one was there. That night, I was too scared to sleep. I stayed awake until 7 a.m., heart pounding, waiting for the sun to come up. The next day, I decided to bless the house, hoping it would put an end to whatever was happening. But honestly, I don't think it worked. First off, I want to apologize for the length of this story, but there's quite a lot to tell. These events happened in Harrison, Arkansas, a small town in northern Arkansas. While I currently live in Missouri, my best friend Samantha lives in Harrison, and this is her story. Samantha is a single mother with a beautiful 7-year-old daughter named Katie. In late 2011, after her marriage ended, she began looking for a new place to live. She quickly found a house for rent, a 2-bedroom home with a full basement and a fenced-in backyard, a perfect deal, given her situation. She called me, excited, and told me she couldn't pass it up. The only other option would have been to move back in with her parents, and she was determined not to do that. Within a week, they moved in. Katie, however, wasn't as excited about the new house. She told Samantha she didn't like it, but her mom figured it was just the natural resistance a child has to leaving their old home behind. Samantha assured Katie she'd eventually come to love the house as much as she had. Initially, everything seemed fine. I visited Samantha and Katie once they were settled in, and I remember thinking, wow, this house is old. Samantha said the landlord told her it was built in 1912. The history alone made me curious. As she gave me the tour, I noticed little things about the house, like the living room, which had a cozy but dated feel, with wood paneling that seemed very 1970s. The layout was interesting. From the living room, a small step up took you into the hallway, which led to a bathroom and Samantha's small bedroom. Across from her bedroom were 3 stairs leading down into the kitchen. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I felt a cold draft. I figured it was just the AC, as it was a warm day outside. From the kitchen, a smaller hallway led to Katie's bedroom and the door to the backyard. Straight ahead was the door to the basement, which Samantha admitted gave her the creeps. But, as she said, it's just a basement. A lot of people find them creepy. She took me down there, and as I descended the stairs, I started feeling lightheaded and a bit dizzy, almost like vertigo. I brushed it off, thinking maybe my blood sugar was low, and suggested we head back upstairs. Later that evening, I left with an odd feeling about the house, but I didn't want to mention it to Samantha. I figured it was nothing. The following week, I called to check in, and the first thing she said was, "My house is haunted." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just an old house making noises, maybe some settling or creaks here and there. But then she started explaining what had been happening. The second week they were there, she had gone to take a shower after Katie was asleep. While in the shower, she heard the bathroom door creak open. Assuming it was Katie, she peeked out, but no one was there. A few minutes later, steam fogged up the glass shower door, and when she went to open it, she saw something that chilled her. A large handprint, much bigger than hers, on the glass. It was clearly a man's handprint. She was understandably freaked out. The next morning, around 4 a.m., Samantha woke to the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. She immediately thought Katie had knocked something over. When she went to check, she found 3 of her grandmother's glass dishes shattered on the floor. The cabinet doors were closed, and there was no logical way the dishes could have just fallen out on their own. She checked on Katie, who was still fast asleep. Things got stranger after that. One day, while Katie was at school, Samantha decided to bring some things upstairs from the basement. The basement had a concrete floor and wood paneling on the walls. While clearing things out, she noticed a large rug hanging on one of the walls. Curious, she decided to take it down and discovered something unsettling. A hidden door behind the rug. It was a wooden door with an old lock, the kind that looked like it belonged in the 1800s. She called the landlord and asked why she hadn't been told about the door. The landlord seemed just surprised as Samantha, claiming she had no idea the door even existed. They decided to investigate together. When they opened the door, both of them immediately felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room behind the door was unfinished, with black-painted wooden walls and floor. There was nothing inside except a wooden table with a bunch of dead roses on it and ropes tied to the walls, like someone had been restrained there at some point. It was eerie, like something out of a horror movie. Samantha tried to take the dead roses out of the room, but every time she reached for them, she felt a wave of panic. She eventually gave up, saying, "Okay, you can keep your flowers," and backed out of the room. locking the door behind her. A few nights later, Samantha had a terrifying nightmare. She dreamed of a little blonde boy and a tall, skinny man living in her house in the 1970s. In the dream, the boy was crying because the man was threatening to kill him. Toward the end of the dream, Samantha saw the man pick up a shotgun, shoot the boy in the head, and then turn the gun on himself. She woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like she had actually heard the gunshot. Minutes later, she heard Katie screaming. Rushing to her daughter's room, Samantha found Katie crying, saying she'd had a bad dream. When Katie described her nightmare, Samantha was floored. It was almost the exact same dream she had just experienced. Katie told her there was a little boy, and his daddy shot him because he was mad at him. The only difference was that Katie claimed the shooting happened in the kitchen. It was too similar to be a coincidence, and Samantha was shaken to her core. As things escalated, Samantha started noticing even more unsettling events, like hearing loud knocking coming from the basement and the basement door opening on its own. One night, she heard 3 loud knocks on the door while making dinner, and that was the last straw. When I came to visit her the next day, I brought a small cross from my own home, hoping it might help. Samantha hung it in the kitchen, which seemed to be the epicenter of the activity. We decided to take a break from the house, so we went out for the day and tried to have a normal girls' day out. But when we returned, we found more broken dishes in the sink, and the cross I had brought was hanging upside down. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. I told Samantha she needed to move or get the house blessed. She broke down in tears, saying she didn't believe in ghosts before this, but now she was terrified. She had signed a year-long lease and didn't know how to get out of it. Since then, Samantha has been trying to research the history of the house, but she hasn't had much luck. Her landlord bought it from an older couple who used it as a summer home. They also claimed to know nothing about the hidden door in the basement. The last I heard from Samantha was about a month ago. She said the knocking had spread from the basement to other parts of the house, and Katie had seen the mean man from her dreams standing in her room. He even got close to her before disappearing. Now Katie sleeps in Samantha's room, and neither of them talks much about what's happening. I can't help but feel worried for them both. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I'm sure Samantha could use some advice, and honestly, I'm curious myself. A few days after I wrote the first story, I reached out to Sam to see how things were going. She said things had calmed down, and both she and Katie could go days without anything happening. Sam had bought a Bible, which she kept open in the kitchen, the most active area of the house, and she would say prayers out loud throughout the house. I was relieved to hear things were improving, even if only slightly. Sam mentioned that the activity had become more sporadic, things like car keys or remotes being moved, lights being on after she was sure she turned them off, and the occasional sound of footsteps. But overall, nothing too alarming. Even Katie seemed to be doing better. She played in her room and was sleeping through the night without any complaints. We caught up for a while, and she promised to let me know if anything new developed, whether good or bad. She also mentioned she was excited about sending Katie to camp for the summer, and that her landlord had given her permission to plant a garden in the backyard. She couldn't wait to get started, especially since her dad was coming over to help, something they loved doing together. Little did I know, I'd be hearing from her the very next day with a whole new development. I was still asleep when she called. It was around 10 in the morning, and after a long 12-hour shift, I hadn't even gotten home until 2 a.m., so I was exhausted. When my phone rang, I answered it half asleep, only to hear Sam sobbing on the other end, with her dad trying to calm her down. Then I heard the word police, and I was wide awake. "Oh my God, what happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sam was still shaken, but she managed to start explaining. Her dad had ordered the truckload of dirt for the garden. She, her parents, and Katie had mapped out a large area along the back of the house, even around by Katie's room, where they planned to plant tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and some flowers Katie had picked out. The truck came, dumped the dirt where they needed it, and her dad started spreading it with a shovel. When he got to the side of the house by Katie's room, his shovel hit something solid. At first, he thought it was a rock or maybe a buried piece of metal. But when he dug around it, he realized it was a bone, what looked like a rib bone from a small child or an animal of similar size. Thinking it might be from a buried pet, he kept digging. But then he found more bones, at least 4, and a piece of cloth that looked like it had once been wrapped around them. The bones were old, as was the cloth, and at that point, everyone was feeling uneasy. Samantha was beyond freaked out. The police were called, and they arrived shortly after. The officers said they wouldn't be surprised if the bones were human, and they sent them off to Texas for examination. They also told Sam and her family that if the bones turned out to be human remains, they'd have to come back and dig up the entire garden area. Sam called me later that day, panicked. "What if it's the little boy from my dream?" she asked, her voice trembling. I tried to calm her down, telling her not to jump to conclusions. We'd have to wait for the examiner's results. That night, with Katie away at camp, Sam said she thought she heard a child laughing in Katie's room. She heard it at least 3 times, and each time it sent chills down her spine. She told me she didn't feel comfortable staying in the house alone anymore, not until she had more answers about those bones. Days passed, and finally, she called me from her parents' house with the results. The examiners couldn't confirm whether the bones were human or not. They labeled the findings inconclusive, though they leaned towards the bones being from an animal. The police believed the bones had likely come in with the truckload of dirt, but Samantha's father wasn't convinced. He believed the bones had been buried there for years, and that if they dug up more of the backyard, they'd find more remains. Sam's mother, on the other hand, wanted to leave well enough alone. She was scared, and she thought digging deeper would only make the haunting worse. In the end, they left the decision up to Samantha. A couple of days later, I called her to ask what she had decided. Her answer surprised me. "I'm looking for a new place to live," she said. She explained that while some people might want to investigate further, maybe even uncover the truth about the little boy in her dream, she wasn't one of them. "I don't want anything to do with this," she said. "I'm scared, and I'm done." She told her landlord she was done with the house, but the landlord reminded her of the lease. Sam's response? "Sue me. It's not worth living here anymore." She's now in the process of moving. Katie is staying with her grandparents until school starts, and Sam is just waiting for her new apartment to be finished, which should be ready by mid-August. She told me recently, "I can't wait to move into my new place and put this all behind me. I just want to look at it as a bad experience I had to go through after the divorce and then move on." I really hope this new chapter brings peace to both her and Katie. After everything they've been through, they deserve it. This story takes place in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a town famously known as one of the most haunted places in the United States. Nestled in the Ozark Mountains, Eureka Springs is not only picturesque, but also filled with eerie paranormal lore. One of the most notable spots in this Victorian-era town is the 1886 Crescent Hotel, which sits atop a mountain and is often cited as one of the most haunted hotels in America. My husband and I have visited the Crescent Hotel at least 5 times. We live only 45 minutes away, and I can't seem to resist going back. It feels like the place is calling me. Taps, the ghost hunters team, even investigated it, which adds to the intrigue. But before I dive into my experiences, here's a bit of backstory on the hotel. The Crescent Hotel was built in 1886, during a time when the healing waters of the Ozarks were drawing people from all over the country. The developers saw an opportunity to create the most luxurious resort hotel in the nation. People would come for the waters and stay for the luxury. There were horses, afternoon tea dances, evening parties, and a full orchestra to entertain guests. But as time went on, people realized that the waters didn't have the miraculous healing properties everyone believed they did, and gradually the hotel's popularity declined. By 1908, the Crescent became a college for women, and later, in 1937, it was bought by a man named Norman Baker, who turned it into a cancer hospital. Baker claimed he could cure cancer without surgery using miracle elixirs. What people didn't know was that Baker had no medical training and had been previously convicted of practicing medicine without a license. His treatments were a scam, and many patients never made it out of the hospital alive. It's rumored that patients who died during treatment were buried somewhere on the property. Baker was eventually arrested for mail fraud, and the hotel went through several owners before it was fully restored to its former glory in 2002. Now about the hauntings. The Crescent is famous for its ghostly residents. One of the most frequently spotted apparitions is Michael, an Irish stonemason who allegedly fell to his death while working on the hotel's construction. Room 218, the room where Michael reportedly fell, is said to be the most haunted. Guests have reported hearing loud pounding on the walls, seeing hands coming out of the bathroom mirror, and even hearing what sounds like a man falling from the ceiling. One guest even ran screaming from the room, claiming to have seen blood splattered all over the walls. There's also the spirit of a nurse, dressed all in white, who is often seen pushing a gurney on the 3rd floor. People hear the squeaks and rattles of the gurney late at night, but she vanishes before reaching the end of the hallway. The hotel's basement, once used as a morgue during the cancer hospital days, still houses Dr. Baker's old autopsy table and walk-in freezer, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. And then there's the crystal dining room, where people report seeing Victorian-era apparitions. Guests have witnessed full-blown ballroom dances in the early hours of the morning, with ghostly figures spinning around the room. There's also the ghost of a 19th-century gentleman who's often seen sitting at a table near the windows, waiting for a woman he claims to have seen the night before. Dr. Baker himself has been spotted too, in the recreation room in the basement and near the 1st floor stairway. He's seen wearing a purple shirt and white linen suit, looking lost and confused, just as he appears in old photos of the infamous con man. One of the most chilling stories involves a young woman who attended the Crescent College. The tale goes that she either jumped or was pushed from a balcony to her death, and to this day, guests report hearing her screams echoing through. The first time I visited the Crescent, I felt a cold burst of air the moment I stepped into the lobby. My husband and mother, who were with me, didn't feel it at all. We overheard another guest at the front desk complaining about getting strange text messages every few hours. The message just said, 12:31:01. The front desk staff told her that they couldn't explain it, but the hotel had been closed on that exact date due to a terrible ice storm, and the guests who were staying there at the time were trapped for a week. Needless to say, the woman was freaked out and went back to her room. After hearing how haunted the place was, I went to use the bathroom, hoping for some paranormal encounter. Unfortunately, nothing happened, but the hotel itself was stunning, with a grand spiral staircase that led from the basement all the way to the 4th floor. As we climbed the stairs, all 3 of us, my husband, my mother, and I, felt dizzy, like we had vertigo. My husband even said it felt like he had an inner ear infection. We decided to take the elevator up to the 4th floor, but as soon as I stepped inside, I had an overwhelming feeling of panic. I don't get panic attacks, but this felt like one was coming on fast. I decided to take the stairs instead, holding onto the railing the entire time, feeling that same dizziness. On the stairs, I passed another guest who seemed to be struggling too. He chuckled and said, "You know, a 5-year-old boy died on these stairs. He had an inner ear infection, lost his balance, and fell all the way to the basement. Since then, nobody can seem to walk these stairs without feeling off balance." My stomach dropped. My husband had mentioned that same feeling, and none of us knew about the boy's death before that moment. When we reached the 4th floor, there was a little bar and restaurant right across from what used to be Dr. Baker's office. They even had old diagrams of the human body on display, the ones Baker used during his treatments. It was creepy, but also fascinating. My mom said that it's probably all the old medical equipment and memorabilia that keeps the spirits hanging around, and honestly, I think she might be right. The view from the 4th floor was gorgeous, and we took a lot of photos. Many of the pictures showed orbs and strange lights. When I looked up similar photos online, I found that other people had captured similar eerie images. While I never saw any Victorian ghosts or heard the nurse's gurney squeaking down the hall, one of my later visits left me with something I can't explain. I kept hearing the name Michael, whispered in my ear over and over again, like someone was right behind me. My husband thought I was imagining it until he went to the bathroom and came out pale-faced. He told me that all of the faucets had turned on by themselves while he was in there, and I had been standing right outside the door the entire time. No one else had come in or out. We haven't been back since that visit, but I would go again in a heartbeat. The Crescent Hotel has this mysterious pull, like it's constantly inviting you back. If you ever find yourself in northern Arkansas and you're up for a paranormal experience, the Crescent Hotel is definitely a place to check out. Just be prepared. You never know what or who you might encounter. My story begins with a family road trip back in the summer of 1971. My mom and dad loaded me and my younger sisters into our old Rambler station wagon, and we set off from Tulsa, Oklahoma, heading to northwest Arkansas to visit my grandmother. We made this trip at least twice a year, and the route was always the same: long stretches of two-lane highways with sharp curves, hilly terrain, and sometimes sheer cliffs right alongside the road. It made for a long, sometimes nauseating journey for 3 kids, all under the age of 9. We'd take Old Highway 33 to the Arkansas border, where it joined up with Highway 68. It was along this stretch of Highway 68, near Batavia, where the road starts winding along a high, narrow ridge, overlooking beautiful valleys and open pastures. As we drove through this scenic area, we suddenly had a blowout. My dad was cursing up a storm, and on these kinds of roads, there weren't any real breakdown lanes. You just had to deal with it. We finally made it past a curve when we spotted a wide patch of ground on the left side, right in front of an old, small white church. The church looked like it had been abandoned for quite some time. There was a faded sign above the double doors that simply said Sharon. Nothing else. It seemed like the perfect spot to stop and change the tire. We all piled out of the car as my parents began pulling out our luggage and cooler to get to the spare tire and jack. My sisters and I, being typical curious kids, started milling around. The church caught my attention. It was clear it hadn't been in use for a long time. The weeds and thistles around it were tall and wild. I noticed there were 4 windows along the side of the church, and one window near the doors had fewer weeds underneath, making it a little easier to access. I decided to take a peek inside, and of course, my sisters followed close behind. The bottom ledge of the window was just low enough for me to look in, so I hoisted myself up to get a glimpse. What I saw inside was a large, empty room with several old wooden benches pushed up against the window ledges. They were coated in dust, untouched for what seemed like years. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows on the opposite side, casting a warm, dusty glow over the entire space. It was quiet and still, and nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as I was about to tell my sisters what I saw, they started pestering me, asking for their turn to look. I turned away for a second to hush them and tell them I'd help lift them up. But when I turned back to the window, there she was. A girl. She was looking right at me from the other side of the glass. I was so startled, I fell backward, landing hard on my rear end. My sisters burst into laughter, completely unaware of what I had just seen, but they helped me up. I didn't say anything at first, too spooked to speak. I hurried them back toward the car, trying to shake off what I'd just witnessed. Midway back to the car, my mom called out, saying Dad was almost done with the tire and we needed to get ready to leave. My sisters wasted no time in tattling that I'd fallen down while trying to peek in the window. Mom dusted me off and told me to get in the car. We continued our drive to Harrison and ended up having a great weekend with my grandmother, but the whole time, I couldn't shake what I saw. And here's the part that has bugged me to this very day. I am positive there was no one in that church. The building had clearly been abandoned for years. The benches inside were covered in dust, stacked 4 or 5 deep against the walls. It wasn't a reflection of one of my sisters. They needed my help just to see through the window. And it wasn't my own reflection either. I had short brown hair with bangs, courtesy of my mom's regular trims. The girl I saw had long blonde hair, braided down her shoulders. She didn't look anything like me or my sisters. I've wondered about that girl ever since. Who was she? And why was she there staring back at me from that abandoned church? Maybe someone out there knows something about this place or has seen this church. I'd love to hear if anyone else has experienced something similar in that area. I have a ghost attached to me. To give you some background, I'm a psychic and my roommate is a medium. When we're together, our abilities amplify, allowing us to sense, feel, hear, and communicate with spirits far more effectively. The paranormal becomes something tangible and real for us in a way it might not for others. But we learned the hard way that it's not always a good thing to mix those abilities with something like a Ouija board. And, well, we did. That's how I met N. We were using the Ouija board, and I could feel a spirit coming through. Young, scared, and very confused. He was tall, extremely tall, and as we communicated with him, we pieced together that he was born in 1919 and likely died at 19. But here's the thing. He doesn't know how he died, or even if he realizes he's dead. Every time we asked for his name, the planchette would move in a jumble of letters, N-O-J-H-G-K, or N-P-I-J. It never made sense. But it always started with N, so I asked if we could just call him that, and he seemed to agree. As we continued to interact with N, strange things began happening. We'd often smell campfire smoke when his presence was near. During one session, while my hands were on the planchette, he moved it slowly and deliberately until my hand was touching my roommate's. It was as if he was trying to connect with me physically, intentionally. He made it clear that he liked me, maybe even more than that. We ended that Ouija board session, but it was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with the unsettling sensation that someone was standing next to my bed, watching me. I was alone in the house, but I could feel someone there, as if their presence was right in the room with me. It freaked me out so much that I didn't even want to take a shower. I couldn't bear the idea of being naked in front of whoever was lurking. Later that day, I had training for my new job. While driving there, I suddenly felt overwhelmed with joy, like I was experiencing someone else's emotions. It wasn't mine. I had no reason to feel such intense happiness, but I did. When I arrived at work and was alone for a moment, my pen started to roll across the table on its own. Not violently, just enough to get my attention. I whispered, "Stop," and it did. When I got back in my car, that smell of campfire smoke was there again. Over the next few days, N stayed close by. He was friendly, protective even, and attached himself to me. He communicated that he would never hurt me, and that he felt safe with me. But as time went on, I began to feel drained. His constant presence was pulling energy from me, and I started to get physically sick. It was like having the flu without the fever. I was exhausted, barely able to walk, and spent most of my time lying down. I ended up talking to my youth group leader, someone I trust deeply. I told her everything, and she prayed over me. As she prayed, she felt a cold sweat wash over her, and I felt it too. That night, I stayed at a friend's house and prayed with all my might. I cried, but they weren't my tears. They were N's. After that emotional release, he left, or so I thought. A month later, my friend and I moved in together, and things took a turn for the worse. Our combined abilities as a psychic and medium brought even more paranormal activity into our space. We promised ourselves we wouldn't touch a Ouija board again, so we made a ghost box to communicate with spirits instead. Through the ghost box, we discovered there were 5 spirits around us. We've directly encountered 3, but a picture we took just yesterday revealed all 5 spirits. There was a man sitting in a chair, another on the couch, one near the trash can, all male. Then there's a woman we sometimes hear crying, and of course, N, standing right next to me, always. In one moment that still gives me chills, we asked the spirit sitting on the couch, "If you want us to sit there, would you stand up please?" Sure enough, after I asked, he stood up. But I never quite know what to do about N. He's what you might call a Casper-type spirit, kind, loving, but incredibly attached. And the truth is, I've grown attached to him too. He's always there, looking out for me, and somehow I feel like I'm supposed to help him. But what do you do when you and a spirit are both attached to each other? That's the question I'm still trying to answer. It all started when I was 6 years old, living in Newport, Arkansas. I'm 17 now. My grandmother, who is the biggest skeptic you'll ever meet when it comes to believing in ghosts, was the first to notice something odd happening. My great-grandfather had passed away years before I was born, and his pictures had been replaced around the house, so I'd never seen him before. My grandmother's house sat right across a large field from ours, and she would often watch me play in that field, either from her living room window or while sitting on her porch. On more than one occasion, she noticed that I would talk to myself, often looking up toward the sky as if someone were standing there with me. Finally, one day she asked, "What are you talking about out there in the field?" While I can't remember my exact response, my grandmother said that it was clear from my answer that I was speaking to someone, not just myself. A week later, she pulled out an old family photo album, and without any prompting, I pointed to a picture of my great-grandfather and said, "That's who I was talking to." This shocked her because I had never seen a picture of him before. Although I don't remember that specific encounter, there is one memory, or maybe an image, that has been stuck in my mind for as long as I can remember. I've always pictured myself as a child, sitting cross-legged in front of a window in the house that used to stand across from my grandmother's, looking out into the field. Standing there in the field is a man, just staring at me. He's not smiling or moving, just standing still with a blank expression on his face, his hands by his sides. The image is so vivid, but I've spent years trying to figure out whether it's a real memory or just something from a dream. Deep down, I feel like it was my great-grandfather watching over me. Fast forward to when I was 13. My mom was taking night classes at the local college, and one evening, I was home alone with my younger sister. We were in my bedroom when we both heard heavy footsteps coming from the laundry room, followed by the distinct sound of a light switch being flipped on. Terrified, we locked ourselves in my room and called my mom, panicking that someone was in the house. She sent my grandfather over right away, gun in hand, and he searched the place thoroughly. No one was there, but one of the bedroom lights had been turned on, just like I heard. I have no explanation for what happened that night, but it scared me to my core. A year later, on my 14th birthday, I had another unsettling experience. It was late at night, and I was in the den watching TV while everyone else was asleep. The lights were off, except for one bedroom light that spilled into the hallway. As I lay there for no reason at all, I glanced toward the light coming from the bedroom. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It started small, then grew larger, like someone was walking toward the doorway. But before anyone could appear, the shadow shrank again, like they were walking away. I froze, my heart pounding, paralyzed with fear. Even now, when I tell this story, my hands and voice shake, and that same terror from that night washes over me all over again. Around the same time, I had 2 friends over for a sleepover. Late that night, with all the lights and TVs off, I decided to do some ghost hunting of my own, inspired by all the paranormal shows I'd been watching. I had a voice recorder, and we all took turns asking questions, hoping to catch something. We didn't hear anything in the moment, but when we played the recording back, we heard it. A little girl humming. The humming lasted for 5 whole seconds, and none of us could explain it. When I turned 16, I moved in with my dad in Captivate, Arkansas. Even though I'd left Newport, the strange occurrences didn't stop. TV channels would change on their own, my dog would bark furiously at nothing, and I'd hear whispers when I was alone. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I was terrified to be in the house by myself, and spent most of my time sitting on the front porch to avoid being inside alone. No one believed me, not even my parents. Now, I'm 17 and living on my own in Poughkeepsie, Arkansas. My stepdad's mother lives just 20 feet away, in the house where my aunt passed away in May from lung problems. Even though I've only been here for a month, I constantly feel like I'm being watched. It's that unsettling feeling of eyes on you, even when there's no one around. I'm always looking over my shoulder. With all that's happened over the years, I'm starting to feel like I'm being followed by something that's been with me since I was a child. If things start happening again, I don't know what I'll do. I'm reaching the end of my rope. When my wife and I first got married, we were on a tight budget. I was still in college, and she was the only one bringing in a paycheck. So when we were looking to buy a home, we didn't have many options and ended up purchasing a mobile home. For the first few years, everything seemed normal. Now I'm a bit particular about keeping things organized. My wife would tell you I have a touch of OCD about neatness. I always know where everything is in our home, and every item has its place. But we started to notice that things would randomly go missing. At first, I just thought I was misplacing stuff, but then it kept happening. I would spend hours searching for items that had disappeared, only for them to reappear in the exact spot I knew I had left them, sometimes days later. My wife would swear she wasn't playing any tricks on me, and frankly, it was driving me crazy. We hadn't really considered that something strange might be happening until I saw something that left me in disbelief. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and I woke up. I sat up in bed, just taking a look around, and there she was. An old lady, standing at the foot of our bed. She didn't vanish right away, so I had a few seconds to stare at her. Instinctively, I swung my arm toward her, thinking someone had broken into the house. But before I could land a hit, she disappeared. I wasn't dreaming. I remember those 2-3 seconds vividly, and I was completely awake. After she vanished, I checked the entire house, making sure all the windows and doors were locked. Everything was secure. I didn't tell my wife about it for 2 years because I knew she wouldn't have been able to sleep if I had. Not long after that, we started hearing strange noises. It would sound like the TV or a radio was playing in the living room, but very faint, like it was turned down really low. My wife and I would search the whole house trying to find the source, but there was never anything on. Our only neighbor, an older lady, went to bed by 8 p.m., and we lived at the end of a dead-end road, so there wasn't anyone else nearby making noise. I'd even go outside and check, but still, nothing. At that time, I worked night shifts, 2 on, 2 off, and would come home early in the morning. My wife had a habit of leaving the groceries, especially soda, by the front door for me to put away when I got home. But sometimes, when she'd go to put the groceries up later, she'd find that the sodas were already stacked neatly by the pantry. Every time she'd thank me, I'd tell her I didn't do it, and we'd joke that our ghost had decided to help out. But one experience stands out more than any other. It was around 5:30 in the evening, and I was getting ready for my night shift. My wife had just bought me some razor refills, and I placed them on the edge of the bathtub while I ran the water for a bath. If you've ever lived in a mobile home, you know the layout. The garden tub is on one side of the bathroom, and the toilet is about 8 feet away on the other side. I left the room briefly to grab a drink, and when I came back, I found the razors lying in front of the toilet. It didn't make any sense. I did my own little experiment, knocking the razors off the tub in various ways to see how far they'd go. The farthest I could get them was about a foot from the tub, unless I threw them, which I obviously hadn't. Something or someone had flung those razors 8 feet across the room in the few seconds I had stepped away. Eventually, we built a house and moved out of the mobile home. I didn't tell my wife about the ghost woman I saw until after we moved. I knew it would have terrified her. We rented out the mobile home for a couple of years before selling it. I never asked the renters if they had any strange experiences, but I've always wondered if they did. The new owners eventually sold the mobile home and built a house on the land where it used to sit. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or the strange things that happened in that mobile home, but I'll never forget it. It was the summer of 2012, a typical quiet day in our small town in central Arkansas. My friends and I were feeling restless, searching for something exciting to do. After a few hours of driving around aimlessly, we found ourselves on the outskirts of Valonia, a rural town known for its quiet, empty roads and farmland. Little did we know that the uneventful day would soon turn into something we would never forget. It was late afternoon, the sun starting its slow descent, when my friend Darren suddenly asked me to stop the truck. He thought he saw something, a narrow footpath barely visible through the tall grass. Intrigued, I turned the truck around and pulled over. We all got out and approached the trail. It was barely noticeable, no wider than a couple of feet, and it stretched into the woods, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Think it's private property? Zach asked. Probably, I replied, eyeing the uninviting path, but curiosity had already taken over. After some debate, we decided to follow the trail, figuring no harm would come from just a quick exploration. As we trekked deeper into the woods, the light from the setting sun started to fade, and the thick canopy of trees above cast long, eerie shadows around us. After what felt like forever, we reached a clearing, and there, standing in the middle of it, was an old, crumbling cabin. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. There was something immediately off about it, a sense of foreboding that settled in the pit of my stomach. The structure was dilapidated, like it had been abandoned for years, if not decades. The front door lay on the ground, rotting away, and the windows were either shattered or boarded up. Despite my instincts telling me to turn around and leave, Darren and Zach were already making their way toward the cabin. "Let's check it out," Darren said with excitement in his voice. I hesitated. "What if someone lives here?" I asked. Darren gestured toward the fallen door. "Nobody's lived here for a long time." With a reluctant sigh, I followed them inside. The air inside the cabin was musty, thick with the scent of mold and decay. The interior was surprisingly intact, as if frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, old newspapers, and personal belongings were scattered across the rooms as though the occupants had left in a hurry. It was unsettling, to say the least. The cabin had 4 rooms, a front room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. We decided to split up and explore. Darren took the front room, Zach wandered into the kitchen, and I, against my better judgment, ventured into the bedroom. The bedroom was small, with a single bed pushed up against the wall and an old, weathered dresser in the corner. Like the rest of the house, it looked like no one had touched it in decades. I wandered around, picking up random objects, a faded photo frame, a cracked mirror, when suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I felt a heavy weight settle on my shoulders, as though something was pressing down on me, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and before I could even process what was happening, I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the presence lingered, oppressive and menacing. I could hear faint, shallow breathing that wasn't mine, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave. At that moment, Zach and Darren burst into the room, their faces pale. "Do you feel that?" Zach asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, and before I could explain what I had just felt, it happened. I felt an invisible force lift me off the ground and hurl me backward, sending me crashing through a partially broken window. The impact was enough to knock the wind out of me, and I hit the ground outside hard, gasping for breath. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the terrified faces of my friends. When I came to, Darren and Zach were standing over me, panic in their eyes. I could barely speak, my body aching from the fall. None of us could explain what had just happened, but we knew one thing for certain. We needed to get out of there, fast. In the following weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The incident played over and over in my mind, and against my better judgment, I returned to the spot where we had found the trail. But when I got there, the cabin was gone. It was as if it had never existed. There was no trace of it, no foundation, no debris, nothing. The clearing was just an empty patch of land. I still can't explain what happened that day. My friends remember it too, so I know it wasn't just a dream or a figment of my imagination. But to this day, I've never experienced anything like it again, and I hope I never do. My first paranormal encounter. In the beginning, I was both curious and skeptical about the paranormal. I always tried to rationalize anything I heard about. But that all changed after my own experience. I had spent decades working as a carpenter until the job began to take its toll on me. Eventually, I left and went back to college, working part-time to support my family. One of my jobs was as a custodian at a local church that had been built in the early 1900s. It was a 2-story building with a basement, and I was tasked with cleaning the older section. The second floor was shaped like a backward L, with multiple rooms on either side. One day, while vacuuming, I noticed something odd. I entered a smaller room, pulling the long vacuum cord behind me, and after a few moments, I turned to find the door had closed behind me. I checked to see if a draft could have caused it, but there was no explanation. A few weeks later, in a larger room down the hall, I dropped the coil of cord, and as soon as I took a step, the entire cord was yanked into the hallway, toward the outlet. I was the only one in the building, so I searched every room, but no one was there. After calming down, I continued my work, only for the same thing to happen again. This time, I was genuinely spooked. The most terrifying experience came a few weeks after that. I was vacuuming the hallway when, out of nowhere, the filter cover on the vacuum flew off and landed several feet away. I bent down to pick it up, and when I looked down the hall, I saw a large black mass floating about 10 feet in front of me. It had no distinct shape, and I couldn't see through it. It wasn't a shadow, it was right in the middle of the hallway. As soon as I realized what it was, it shot toward me at lightning speed and went through me. I screamed and jumped back, hitting the wall behind me, completely shaken. After that, I was too rattled to continue working that night and went home. Though I managed to go back the next day and finish my duties, nothing else happened during my remaining time there. However, ever since that day, I've become something of a paranormal magnet, experiencing strange phenomena wherever I go. Some experiences have been mild, while others have truly scared me. After experiencing a few paranormal moments, life has taken an interesting turn. My close friends and family have grown so used to the unusual occurrences that they often roll their eyes when something goes bump in the night. They've come to expect it, and sometimes it even brings a laugh. A few years ago, I moved to a small house near Oxford, Arkansas. It was a simple place, living area, kitchen, and the bedroom, connected to an adjacent utility room leading to the bathroom. Strange things started happening soon after I settled in. At first, it was little things. I'd wake up to find my stereo turned on, despite knowing I had switched it off. Objects would disappear and reappear, even though I was the only one living there. One night, my neighbor came over, and we were chatting in the kitchen. Out of nowhere, a bowl sitting on the counter rotated halfway by itself. We both saw it happen. She freaked out, but surprisingly, she did come back to visit. One weekend, a friend stayed over with his yellow lab, Buck. We planned a barbecue with some friends, and as Buck ran excitedly through the house, checking out each room, the night seemed like it would be fun. Later, when I went inside to tidy up the kitchen, I noticed something strange. A large framed mirror that had been securely placed behind the bathroom sink was now lying on the floor, leaning perfectly against the sink. There was no way it could have fallen without shattering, yet it remained intact. I called my friend in to show him, and even he was puzzled. As we stood there, Buck approached the utility room where the mirror had been, and out of nowhere, he started barking aggressively, refusing to cross the room's threshold. Buck wouldn't go near that area for the rest of the weekend. The next morning, as we were deciding on breakfast, something eerie happened. I opened the fridge, and suddenly, I felt something hit my leg. I turned to find a small vase on the floor, and my friend was standing there, wide-eyed and speechless. He explained that the vase had flipped off the top of the fridge, sailed over my head, and hit my calf as I opened the fridge. His reaction was priceless, but from that moment on, he preferred to ignore these strange events whenever they happened around him. There were plenty of other minor incidents in the house, objects moving, strange sounds, but the most unsettling event occurred when I was home alone. One night, after being asleep for a while, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps. They were clear, as if someone was walking around the front of the house. Startled, I reached for my firearm, but as the footsteps moved toward the utility room, I realized I could see everything in the moonlight. Yet no one was there. I could hear the footsteps clearly, and they continued down the hall, entering my bedroom. I watched, wide-eyed, as the sound moved past the foot of my bed and around to the other side. Yet I saw no one. The sound stopped midway up the bed, and I sat there, staring at that spot for at least an hour, too terrified to go back to sleep. The next morning, I got up, and as I walked through the house, I realized that my own footsteps on the carpet made the exact same sound I had heard the night before. The unsettling experience in my Arkansas home. I left my previous story at the part where something entered my room and stopped on the other side of my bed. This story picks up just a few weeks after that strange, terrifying experience. Ever since that unsettling night, I was on high alert. It was the first time I felt truly threatened. At that point, I wasn't well versed in dealing with hauntings or spirits. One weeknight, I went to bed early, as usual, since I'm an early riser. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a horrific nightmare, leaving me drenched in sweat. The darkness of the dream still lingers in my memory, though the details have faded. I got up, had some water, and waited for the sheets to dry. Eventually, I shifted to one side of the bed to avoid the damp area and tried to fall back asleep. That's when I heard it, a strange, unsettling sound coming from the foot of the bed. My ears perked up as I strained to catch it again. I grabbed a pillow and propped myself up against the footboard, trying to locate the source. Then I heard it again, a low, eerie noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard. It resembled the sound of a spray paint can being discharged, but in a much deeper, more disturbing tone. The sound moved up and down the wall, starting slowly, then picking up pace, becoming repetitive and louder. My eyes widened in fear, unsure of what was happening. Before long, the sound grew maddeningly intense, echoing through the room. It became clear that whatever it was coming from the bathroom opposite my room. Gathering the little courage I had, I flipped the light on in the utility room as I approached the bathroom. The noise was deafening, and I couldn't bring myself to enter. The shower curtain was drawn, and I was too terrified to open it. Instead, I grabbed a broom, stretched it out as far as possible, and yanked the curtain open. But there was nothing, was there? Just the horrible, evil sound swirling around the tub, growing angrier by the second. I was paralyzed with fear, tears streaming down my face. The sound, which had taken on a malevolent presence, seemed to pause in front of me as if acknowledging my presence, then resumed spinning violently in the small space. Then, in the strangest twist, the sound shifted. It moved lower, spiraling down the drain. I could hear it fade away through the plumbing. I was left standing there, shaking, still clutching the broom in disbelief. I hurried to the front room, pacing back and forth, my heart racing. I texted my friend Jennifer, who tried her best to comfort me over the phone, but I was beyond consolation at that point, unsure of what to do next. After a while, I knew I had to get some rest. Reluctantly, I went back to my bedroom, every light in the house blazing. I slid into bed, but kept to the far side, keeping an eye on the doorway. As I lay there, something sat on the bed, right where the presence from the last encounter had stopped. It pressed down on the mattress, and I could see the indentation. I screamed, bolting from the room once more, my body trembling with fear. The oppressive feeling of dread and malevolence was overwhelming. I felt it radiating from the utility room into the front of the house like a thick, suffocating fog. I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. Even Jennifer, still on the phone, couldn't help much at this point. There was nowhere for me to go, and the cold February night meant I couldn't just run outside in my underwear. I spent hours curled up in the corner of the front room, refusing to take my eyes off the utility room. The atmosphere was thick and charged with something hostile. Eventually, the feeling dissipated enough for me to hurriedly grab some clothes and leave the house. I arrived at work hours early, still rattled by the night's events. My coworkers could see how shaken I was, and I confided in one person about what had happened. The day passed in a blur, and though I dreaded returning home, I knew I had no choice. When I did return, the house still had an unsettling air, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I didn't dare sleep in that bedroom again. Instead, I set up an air mattress in the front room and spent the next 2 weeks there until I moved out for good. Compared to other stories, this may not seem like a big encounter, but for me, it was terrifying. It shook me to my core. I've always enjoyed horror movies, but after that night, I couldn't bear anything that scared me. I never found out what caused the disturbances, nor do I want to. I rarely pass through Melbourne anymore, but when I do, I avoid that house at all costs. Greetings, YGS members. Ever since I experienced the big one, I've been left with a strange ability, whether I want it or not, to feel, see, and experience moments that I never had before. There's no clear sense, rhyme, or reason to the timing, magnitude, or location of these experiences. One place that's particularly special to me is our cabin on 80 acres in the heart of the Ozark National Forest. We've enjoyed this cabin since the late 80s, and I had never encountered anything unusual there, until after the big one. Since then, we've had numerous unexplained events like footsteps, items moving, and odd sounds. One of my favorite stories happened one late evening while visiting with friends and family around the fire pit. I needed to step away to relieve myself. As I turned to walk back to the group, I distinctly felt something brush against my leg and through my open hand. It felt just like a dog trotting ahead of me. The strange part is, we didn't have any dogs with us that night. It's worth mentioning that the current cabin was built in the 80s, right on the spot where my great-grandfather had a cabin in the early 1900s. That connection to the past has always made me wonder if it has something to do with the activity we've experienced there. What's odd is that, even though I've had numerous paranormal encounters, there are some places that you'd expect to be full of energy, but they remain quiet. For instance, my adopted mother lives in a house built in the late 1800s in Heber Springs, AR. I always thought it would be crawling with entities, but I've never felt anything there. It's strange how these experiences seem to pick and choose their locations. Now back to my current home in Bethesda, AR. Since we moved in at the end of June 2010, we've had constant visits from something, or several somethings. Every night, it seemed like something would go bump. Cabinet doors would open on their own, sometimes dropping a piece of Tupperware. Or we'd hear new and unexplainable sounds. Some activity would occur in the bedroom with us, while other sounds seemed to come from just around the corner, where we couldn't see. On several nights, we'd wake to the sound of crackling coming from the foot of the bed. It was hard to describe until 1 week later, I was opening a bottle of Absolute vodka. You know that semi-hard plastic seal you have to peel off? When you squeeze it, it makes a specific crackling noise. That's exactly what we heard in our room, only there was nothing there that would make such a sound. Sometimes things quiet down, but there are moments when it ramps back up. Last night, for instance, we had 3 unexplainable occurrences, none of which we could debunk. It seems like we're in for another active phase. It sounds like Sophie, your Shih Tzu, is deeply connected to the unusual occurrences in your home, and the experiences you describe are quite unsettling. There's definitely a possibility that what you're experiencing could be Sophie's doppelganger, or some kind of spirit mimicking her actions. Doppelgangers in paranormal terms are often seen as spirit doubles that can resemble living beings and sometimes mirror their behaviors. The fact that both you and Jennifer have seen what appears to be Sophie in places she couldn't have possibly been, like coming out of the bathroom or barking at the door while she's far away, suggests there could be something more going on. This phenomenon of seeing doubles, especially when they behave independently of the real individual, often points to something supernatural. Sophie's reaction, like tucking her tail, running from one room to another, or growling at seemingly empty spaces, indicates that she's aware of whatever entity or energy is present. Dogs are known for their heightened sensitivity to energies, especially when it comes to paranormal phenomena. It could very well be that this entity is not just mimicking her, but also causing her discomfort. As you've observed her sudden anxious behavior and reluctance to stay in certain areas. The unexplained noises you both hear, like multiple Sophie-like sounds in the middle of the night, also raise more questions. It's interesting that these noises have persisted over time, though they have reduced in frequency. This could suggest that whatever entity is in your home becomes more active or powerful at certain times. When you mentioned hearing Sophie's bark at the door, only to find her much farther away moments later, it's as though this entity is trying to play tricks or confuse you. It might not be malevolent in nature, but it's certainly interacting with both Sophie and your surroundings in a way that disrupts your normal routine. In terms of what this entity could be, and why it's interacting with Sophie in such a way, it's hard to say definitively. However, if the entity is manifesting as Sophie's doppelganger, it could be part of the overall haunting or energy in your house. Doppelganger experiences can sometimes be linked to energy imprints in a home, or even spirits playing tricks, mimicking the living to draw attention. Since your attempts to verbally address the entity and ask it to leave Sophie alone haven't seemed to work, you might want to explore other ways of setting boundaries with the spirit. This could involve a spiritual cleansing of the house, setting up protective symbols, or even consulting a paranormal expert if the activity intensifies. Sophie's well-being is clearly affected by whatever is present in the house, and animals can be more vulnerable to this kind of energy. If you continue to notice Sophie being bothered or frightened, it may be worth doing a deeper investigation to protect both her and your home. What you're dealing with certainly seems paranormal, and with Sophie being alone for extended periods, she could be more exposed to the energy or presence when you're not around. Whatever it is, it seems like it's drawn to her for some reason. I hope you're able to find a solution that brings peace to your household, and most importantly, to Sophie. It sounds like Mr. Winfred was an unusual and rather mysterious visitor, especially with the way he appeared and disappeared so quietly and suddenly. The repeated sightings in your peripheral vision, combined with the feelings of awareness but no direct sense of threat, suggest that this entity or presence might have been more of an observer than an intruder. The fact that it didn't feel hostile or menacing but just seemed to be watching is intriguing, and it aligns with many descriptions of shadow figures or entities that appear briefly and fade away when noticed. Your theory about not looking directly at it makes sense, as many people who encounter paranormal phenomena report similar experiences where looking at these entities head-on causes them to vanish. It seems like the presence of Mr. Winfred was more of a curious, non-interfering figure, which adds a whole new layer to the encounter. His stature and the way you described his posture, tall, rigid, dressed in black, brings to mind something more formal or even authoritative, as if he was observing without intent to communicate or engage, at least not yet. It's interesting that this figure never returned after that day. It makes one wonder if there was a specific reason for his appearance that day, perhaps tied to something in the house, the land, or even your own energy while working on your projects. Sometimes these entities seem to show up for no obvious reason, but leave a lasting impression, much like how Mr. Winfred did with you. Even though he hasn't returned, it might be worth keeping an eye out for any subtle changes or signs in your environment. Whether he was connected to the history of the land, the energy around you, or simply passing through, your openness to these experiences likely makes you more attuned to them than others. It's always fascinating to hear how such encounters shape people's lives and homes. Keep us updated if anything else happens, as this might just be the beginning of more unique experiences.